She was a devoted wife, living in the lap of luxury.
They were rolling in the money, I'll give them that one.
He was a stock car racing star who fell hard for the pit crew beauty.
I think he really loved her, and I think she really loved him.
He was always holding hands, hugging and kissing and all of that, you know.
But when police receive a harrowing 911 call,
"Oh God, I'm full of blood,"
and discover the former racetrack champion dead under mysterious circumstances, investigators suspect there's more to this couple's love life than meets the eye.
Something just doesn't smell right. He told her she was crazy.
Then I've heard drugs, too.
As detectives race to find a killer, they encounter a tightly wound web of lies, conspiracy, and a string of potential suspects around every turn.
Glad to get you out of it.
Very few times in my career have I actually had the opportunity to talk to a sociopath. This was one of them.
She was going to take care of it herself.
I couldn't understand it. I still don't.
Wednesday, October 8th, 2008. It's been a relatively quiet afternoon for the emergency dispatchers in Robinson, Texas, a small suburb on the outskirts of Waco. But at 5:23 p.m., a caller in distress prompts an unexpected change of pace.
EMS, what is the address of your emergency?
my husband's laying in a pool of blood. Looks like somebody's been in here.
Okay. Is he breathing?
Honey, there's blood all over the bed. My sister's crazy. Oh God, he's so.
Okay, well, I have some help on the way. I'm going to stay on phone with you until they get there, okay?
When police arrive, the hysterical woman from the 911 call guides them into the house. The woman identifies herself as Joyce Sturdivant and directs officers to the master bedroom. Lying face down on the bed is her husband, Joe Sturdivant.
He was laying like he was sleeping and had an apparent gunshot wound to the back.
There was stippling, powder burn, so it was a fairly close range shot. Did not see any shell casings or anything of that nature.
As officers take a closer look, they notice a second wound.
He was shot in the back of the head. To me, that was the most telling wound because there was blood everywhere.
With obvious signs of a homicide, police hope some answers lie with the woman who called 911. Joyce Sturdivant was born Joyce McMullen in 1945 in Waco, Texas. The McMullens were well-to-do, and Joyce was the baby of the family.
So she was kind of like the spoilt one of the whole family. Even though she was a very pretty woman and kept herself really nice, she had that tomboy side to her that didn't mind getting dirty.
She liked cars, and she knew everything about a car.
It was her affection for cars that led Joyce into the arms of her first love, a local race car mechanic named Joe Sullins.
They met on the drag, went out a couple of times, and then they hooked up. They got married.
By her mid-20s, Joyce and her husband had 2 children, and together they ran an operation building stock cars for some of the best drivers on the Texas dirt track circuit.
My dad did build cars, race cars. If he was underneath the hood of one, she was there with him, no matter what it was. She loved it. She loved the speed of it, the adrenaline.
One of the drivers Joyce's husband worked with most was a slightly older man by the name of Joe Sturdivant.
Mom, Dad, and Sturdivant became all friends to the racing end of it, back when he was driving my dad's car.
From a young age, Joe was enamored with the ladies. But at 18, he was forced to settle down when his girlfriend got pregnant.
She was only 15 when they married. They had to get married, and I can remember our daddy marching him down, you got this girl in trouble, you're going to marry her, and he did. But they didn't stay married very long. He had left his first wife and kids. Joe had an eye for the women. There's no getting around that.
But if there was one thing Joe loved more than the ladies, it was racing cars.
He was good on asphalt, but dirt was his game. He'd walk out in the track, and he'd pick up the dirt, and he'd feel of it, and roll it around his hands, and he'd walk around, and he'd walk over and tell his brother what to do to the car. He was the best I ever seen.
On the track, he was tough. He was tough. He won a lot of championships. He was an aggressive driver.
If he lost one time to you, he wasn't going to lose a second time.
But in the early 1970s, when Joe locked eyes with the beautiful tomboy who was working on one of his race cars, he knew he'd met his match.
Joyce was a real strong-headed person. I think that's why he was attracted to her. And I think she was attracted to him. He was a good-looking guy. And as the saying goes, one thing led to another.
She was a very pretty woman. Joyce was very pretty.
Despite Joyce being married to one of his close friends, Joe couldn't resist her allure.
It was during the last 6 months of my mom and dad's marriage is when it all fell apart. Because she was sneaking around meeting Sturdivant. So Dad followed him and caught him right then. And he told Sturdivant, then you can have her.
With their passion for each other running in the red zone, Joe and Joyce married in January of 1973, shortly after her divorce from Joe Sullins was finalized.
They were a very good team. They got along together. I never saw her have a crossword with one another, ever.
Joe brought Joyce into the fold with his auto business called Sturdivant Auto Transmissions. Trading on Joe's fame as a driver and Joyce's ability to balance the books, Sturdivant Transmissions was a bona fide success.
Joyce run the office at the shop. She took in the money, took it to the bank, and all of that. You know, and Joe, he run the shop, but she ran the office.
Joyce helped build that business as well as Joe did. Joe may have started the business, but I don't think without Joyce, it would have been as successful as it was.
And the happy couple didn't mind enjoying the fruits of their success.
She'd see something, say, oh, look there, Joe, ain't that's nice, that's nice. Well, the next day it'd show up at the house, he'd go buy it for her.
They were rolling in the money.
With a solid financial footing, Joe and Joyce were determined to build their dream home.
Joe told me it was 50 acres. He had it surveyed, and he put the house in the middle of it because he didn't want no neighbors.
It was a huge house. It was really, really a nice home.
Joyce and Joe needed all the space they could get, since they were also raising Joyce's children from her first marriage, Tina and little Joe.
Joe was a good dad to him. Sometimes I think he wasn't a good dad to his other children, so he was a good dad to these kids. Whatever those kids wanted, Joe bought for them.
Little Joe tried to drive a race car a little bit. He had the best he could. He wasn't what Big Joe was.
And Joe, he put little Joe to work as one of his employees. And of course, he expected more out of him than the other people that worked for him.
By 2000, Joe decided to hang up his helmet, giving up dirt track racing to focus full-time on the transmission business. But after a couple of health scares, Joe decided to step back from the auto shop too.
Joe had some health problems. Joe had bypass surgery.
As his health situation changed, he was kind of glad to take his hands off of that operation. And Joyce was still running the books, and she was still collecting the money, and that aspect of it never changed. He was happy to leave her to run that way. As Big Joe was stepping down or diminishing his involvement, then Little Joe saw that opportunity to try to become more involved in running it.
It was very rare for Joe to come anywhere near the transmission shop since he'd retired. He was enjoying his retirement.
They had a lot of happy times. It was good.
But in 2008, the Sturdivant family's perfect life is turned upside down when Joe is found dead in his bedroom.
He had been shot while he was asleep. When he went to bed that night, he never woke up.
Coming up, investigators will soon discover there's more to this deadly scene than meets the eye.
year prior, there was a home invasion there where actually Mr. Sternovit was assaulted.
"68-year-old Texas stock car racing champ Joe Sturdivant has been shot to death in the master bedroom of the dream home he shares with his wife Joyce in suburban Waco.
He was very cold to the touch. He had been there for a while. He was still in his underwear. Appeared that he had never gotten up that morning.
Some of the drawers had been left open as if they had been rifled through, that sort of thing. And then, of course, it was horrific the way that he was shot. And so that caught our attention.
As detectives process the scene, they realize they've been to this residence before, just 1 year ago.
I was called out to the Sternovit home on a home invasion. Supposedly somebody had come to the home while Mr. Sternovit was sleeping and attacked him.
He awoken with a black male trying to choke him in the bed, began fighting with him. The last thing he remembered was being hit over the head with something. The bedroom was in disarray. You could tell there'd obviously been a good fight there. There was blood all over the floor. According to Joyce, she was hit over the head and had been knocked out temporarily while this fight was taking place with Joe.
It appeared to be a break-in, and these guys attacked Big Joe. Seemed to make sense that it was just a random burglary.
Joe kept money in the house, a lot of money in the house. And I think him talking about it to people, it probably got around to some undesirable people.
Thankfully, Joe and Joyce survived that attack. But unfortunately for Joe, this time he wouldn't be so lucky.
This just could have been a second attempt of a robbery or a burglary that had gone bad. They had a gun safe. There was a wrench found there. There was some keys found there.
We did notice that there were an ice pick and like a meat fork in front of that, like if someone had tried to pick the door.
He had no reason to suspect anything different than a couple of guys tried to break into his house and rob him.
To unravel the mystery, detectives start with Joe's wife, Joyce. She tells police her husband had still been asleep when she'd left the house that morning.
Joe was still in bed, according to her, and she had gone to work, and it was just a normal day.
She spent 8 hours at work, and when she came home, she found her husband shot and killed in his bed. And she called 911. She was just very cooperative. There's no reason to suspect Joyce.
Knowing that at any time she could leave, we made the decision to go ahead and take her clothes into evidence.
Joyce turns her clothes over to the investigators and grants them permission to conduct a thorough search of the couple's property.
She gave us consent to search the house, looking for a murder weapon or any type of evidence that would assist us.
As CSIs process the house for additional clues, detectives ask Joyce to come down to the station to see if she can help shed light on what might have led to Joe's murder.
You normally get home around 5:30 or?
Anywhere from 4:30 to 5:30.
Did you notice anything out of the ordinary when you came home, or everything looked like he was back home just like a normal day?
Yeah, when I went into the house, I noticed that in the utility room, in the utility room and the kitchen had grass all stowed in there, and drawers were open like he'd been digging for something. Like he'd open a drawer and he'd just jerk everything out and throw it up on the counter. I'd come along behind, pick it back up and put it back up. And I'm hollering at him for getting grass. I'm cussing him because he's late. I'm sorry, I just feel bad about cussing him. He didn't do it. I went around the corner. Back there, he was still in bed.
Okay.
And I thought first he had another heart attack. He was in an awkward position. So I went over to the bed and shook him the covers.
Right.
And he didn't do anything. And so I reached up a little further and shook him again. So I put my hands on him, trying to roll him over, and I was shaking him, and when he was coming awake, that's when I called 911.
But could Joe's murder have any connection to the robbery a year earlier?
They took the money.
Okay. Did he carry a wallet? Okay. Did not carry a wallet. Okay.
He just carried his money in a rubber band, just wrap it up like a half sandwich and put a rubber band around it.
Okay.
That was his money clip.
Okay. How much cash did he normally keep on him?
He probably have anywhere from $500 to $5,000. I never knew what he had.
Joyce explains that 2 handguns, a watch, and some of her jewelry are also missing.
Pennant, butterfly.
Okay.
Okay, it is pink. Not bright pink, it's a pale pink.
Okay.
Like the wings are outlined in little small diamonds. I've got the blue one.
picture of that for us?
I've got the blue one and the pink one.
Despite signs that point to a robbery gone awry, detectives know it's highly unusual for a thief to strike the same place twice.
We immediately have to look at our victim, maybe enemies that he may have had, reasons why somebody would want to murder Joe.
He hasn't said anything or mentioned anything about any trouble with anybody or anything like that. Okay. Can you think of anybody that would want to harm him for any reason?
Joe was real proud. He had trouble with somebody or something. I may not find out about 5 or 6 months till he took care of himself.
Following Joyce's interview, robbery still seems the most likely motive, but as CSIs continue to process the scene, they uncover additional evidence that seems to call that theory into question.
Normally in a burglary situation, if you're going to open drawers, you're going to dump the contents out. There were some of the drawers in the dresser that appeared to have just been opened.
Detectives also noticed something odd about the gun safe.
Not many people would use a pipe wrench to try to get into a safe.
And if this wasn't a real robbery attempt, maybe that first home invasion wasn't either.
Whoever tried the first time, maybe it was more than a home invasion. Sounds like they were maybe trying to kill him then and succeeded this time.
In her interview with police, Joyce told detectives that she didn't know anyone who would want to kill her husband. But as investigators question others familiar with Joe, they uncover an entirely different story.
Cases such as these in smaller communities, you get a lot of people call in. A lot of them are rumors, but we record all these calls, all these tips, receive some information that Mr. Sturdivant may be involved in maybe some type of drug trafficking. Was also said at one point that he was involved in gambling.
As police dig into the drug angle, they receive a new lead, one that suggests another, equally salacious motive behind Joe Sturdivant's murder.
Joe was accused of, back then it was sexual misconduct.
Former Texas race car driver Joe Sturdivant and his loving wife Joyce were living a dream life together. But on the 8th of October 2008, Joe was found dead in his home.
Joe was known to keep cash around, always had guns. He always was known to keep a large amount of cash on him. Our main initial thought was that someone had attempted to rob the house.
But as investigators speak to others in the tiny town of Robinson, another possible motive for the crime comes to light.
Cases such as these in smaller communities, you get a lot of people call in. We document and record all these calls, all these tips, receive some information that Mr. Sturdivant may be involved in some type of drug trafficking.
You hear the rumors he was transporting narcotics, or he was only dealing in cash and he's got it buried out here. We heard a lot of that.
We talked to close family, friends, and associates, and never once did we ever get any credible information that that was true.
If the murder is not related to drugs, Joe's friends and family inform police of another possible motive tied to Joe's well-known affinity for women: jealousy.
He had a lot of affairs. So this could have been one of the angry husbands or boyfriends.
However, the condition of the crime scene suggests the killer was someone more familiar to Joe and his pair of hyper-vigilant watchdogs.
The house was basically secure. There was no evidence of any break-in.
Whoever did this was able to get in the house without alarming the dogs. They had bitten some of the rescue personnel that were trying to come in, barked continuously. For them not to wake Joe up, it had to be somebody that the dogs knew.
With nowhere else to turn, investigators decide to take a deeper look into Joe Sturdivant's past. That's when Joe's stepdaughter Tina comes forward with some new, eye-opening information.
Joe wasn't a saint. Back in the 70s, he was indicted. He was accused of molesting a family member.
That was an incident involving Joyce's daughter, where Joe was accused of sexual misconduct.
He had molested me since I was 5 years old. When we pressed charges, other people started coming forward. I wonder why 3 of my best friends never wanted to come back over or spend the night. And that was why.
Although others came forward with accusations of abuse, Joe adamantly denied these charges. And through it all, Joyce stood by him.
Joyce took Joe's side over the daughter back then.
She chose him over me, and I'm your daughter. She chose his side. She made her decision. She's my mom. I love her. It's just hard to forgive her.
Despite the severity of the accusations, Joe managed to avoid any jail time.
When I pressed charges, of course, I had to go before the grand jury, and they indicted him. And they arrested him. But he makes bond. And was ready to go to trial that day, and he made a plea bargain. So he got 10 years probation with the fine, which to me wasn't nearly enough, but he's the one that's had to answer for it.
He had a past, and we had to look at all those avenues and any possibilities that could have something come up over years of a grudge.
But in speaking with Joyce's daughter, Tina, it's clear to investigators that she had nothing to do with her stepdad's murder.
The daughter really hadn't had any contact with Joyce or Joe for, 20, 30 years at that point.
Those type of leads you have to look into, especially in a circumstantial case. You don't ever want to leave any rabbit trails unlooked at. It was ruled out pretty quick.
Someone would give us a name, and we would look into that, and we'd be able to pretty quickly exclude them simply due to the fact that either they were out of state or, there was no obvious contact there for several years.
But if stepdaughter Tina or Joe's other victims aren't responsible for his death, is it possible that stepson Little Joe is responsible? After all, Little Joe had put in years of work at his stepfather's auto business. Maybe he decided that it was finally time to get what he thought he deserved.
I always thought that Little Joe had something to do with it. I think he did not work a whole lot. I think he and Joe had not parted ways, but I think Joe had gotten enough of Little Joe not working like he should, and I think Joe was fixing to cut the money off, and I think Little Joe got mad at Big Joe.
Quite frankly, I thought it might have been little Joe. Now, of course, we didn't have any evidence on Joe other than he was very familiar with the layout, with the dogs, but I believe the detectives also checked out and he had an alibi. So my thought was wrong. And there was no one else that we could focus in on.
With no other leads, police get a phone call that changes everything.
Out of the blue, we got a call from the jail. One of the supervisors out there said that they had someone in jail.
That's who is murdered, right? Correct. Okay. I was approached about that back in the summer.
He starts telling us that he was approached by a lady that he knew. They were from hanging around at some apartment complexes in Waco. They hang out at different pools, drink beer, and she had been asking him if either he would or if he knew of someone who would murder someone for money.
Cowboy Tate tells detectives that the woman's name is Deborah Dietrich. This is the first investigators have heard of Deborah Dietrich. Could she be one of Joe's jilted lovers? What Cowboy Tate reveals next will steer the investigation in a whole new direction.
When you look at the big picture, what they say makes perfect sense in the context of what has happened here.
She pointed him out and said, that's the man that we need murdered.
You know, he was mean to her. He treated her like shit.
It's been nearly a week since Joyce Sturdivant's frantic 911 call hurled investigators into the baffling case of her husband Joe's murder. But now, detectives have finally received a break.
They had someone in jail that had some information about the murder, and they wanted to talk to us.
The man, who goes by Cowboy Tate, tells detectives a woman named Deborah Dietrich approached him with a proposition.
She actually took him to a parking lot across from Joe Sturdivant's favorite cafe. She pointed him out, Joe Sturdivant, in the vehicle he was driving, and said, that's the man that we need murdered.
She thought I was a badass man. I told Debbie out of it. I swear to God, I told Debbie out of it.
And he told her she was crazy, and he actually placed a phone call to Waco Crime Stoppers, waited for Waco police to show up. They were tied up on calls, and in the process, the informant got scared and went back to work.
Detectives question why Deborah Dietrich might have wanted Joe Sturdivant dead. That's when Cowboy Tate drops a bombshell. According to him, Deborah wasn't hiring a hitman for herself.
I know for a fact his wife had it done. That's what I heard. You know, he was mean to her. He treated her like shit.
Joyce had convinced Deborah that she was being abused by Joe and mistreated, and that the only escape that she had was to get rid of him.
You know, I wasn't surprised. We all knew that if something ever happened to Joe, it was one of two things. It was either a jealous husband or Joyce.
Armed with this game-changing revelation, police need to track down Deborah.
Conducted surveillance on the apartment complex when she was coming home. Approached her, introduced ourselves, asked her if she'd be willing to talk to us, and she agreed, and she actually followed us out here to the police department.
According to Deborah, she'd gotten to know Joyce after she delivered parts to the auto shop.
They developed this friendship, and I guess Joyce must have felt like, it was a pretty close relationship.
So is your husband taken care of? What do you mean by taken care of?
Just, talk to Cowboy. Cowboy told me, no, Debbie, you don't know what you're getting into. You don't want to date. You need to just leave it alone.
Did you talk to anybody else, or?
I dropped it.
Okay. Then how did it come up again?
she kept on asking me.
Deborah says that's when she reached out to another man named Carlos, an acquaintance of Cowboy Tate.
Then I met Carlos.
What did you say to him?
I asked him if he knew any bad people that could take care of somebody. He said, yeah.
Deborah encountered these guys out at her apartment complex, and they got to know each other, and she felt like they could carry the plan out.
They wanted, cash. They wanted $20,000. Debbie told us when she approached Joyce, about the money, she said, I've got these rings, and they're worth a whole lot more money than that.
Okay. She hands the rings to you and says, here's the payment for them to kill my husband. Did she say anything else?
And you hurry up and do it.
But according to Deborah, the two hitmen took Joyce's jewelry, but failed to live up to their end of the bargain.
They never did the job. So basically they just, they ripped off Joyce and Debbie at that point. Debbie said when she told Joyce about it, she got pretty upset.
I guess she was going to take care of it herself.
Take care of herself and
do it herself.
She was going to kill him herself.
At that point, we were feeling real confident. We're getting to a point where we were able to confirm stories.
He had the jail informant, which helped us corroborate that.
On October 16th, 2008, police tracked down one of the alleged hitmen, Carlos Garcia.
He tells us that Debbie had approached him and a friend of his about killing somebody, and they thought she was crazy. We never intended to kill anybody. We were just going to try to roll Debbie.
After speaking with Carlos, detectives are eager to once again talk to Joyce Sturdivant. But before they get that chance, a call comes in from Deborah Dietrich, who says she has more information she wants to get off her chest.
She came in and her conscience just told her she needed to come let somebody know.
She was going to do it while he was still laying in the bed. Because she was going to shoot him. And she would leave to come to work and nobody would know anything. And she would go home and she'd be the one to find him. She said she was going to ransack the house, make it look like somebody broke in. Here's something else too. She just told me that she's tried to have it been knocked off once before.
Did she tell you when she's done this? Or when that happened?
She just said a year ago.
According to Deborah, the home invasion in 2007 was Joyce's first attempt at killing Joe. She says that one of the men involved in the attack is a friend of hers named Ali Mohammed, who went by the nickname Doc.
I went to Doc's house. His initial response was, well, I wondered how long it was going to take y'all to come talk to me. It was almost like it was a relief to him.
He had known the Sturdivants for many, many years.
What Joyce had been feeding him was that Joe had been abusing her, both verbally and physically.
But was Joyce Sturdivant truly a victim of abuse? Detectives aren't so sure.
We looked into that. We found no indication, no reports where the police had been called. Doc was just, whatever Joyce told him, he pretty much would believe.
He needed money. He was in a money bind. And so she loaned it to him.
But according to Doc, even after getting paid, he still wasn't up to carrying out Joyce's hit on Joe.
He was not healthy enough to climb the fence and go in there and fight Joe. So he got a friend of his, Chris Chapman, tells him to rough up the guy and kill him.
Chapman was one who went into the house in 07 and assaulted Joe Sturdivant. Mohammed provided him with a knife and then a gun to go in and teach Mr. Joe Sturdivant a lesson.
In the end, Joe woke up right before the attack, and he was the one who taught Chapman a lesson.
He said when he got in the house, Joe Sturdivant got the best of him. He was actually scared Joe Sturdivant was going to take his life, and he was lucky to have fled the house alive.
Now investigators have multiple reports detailing Joyce's murderous plans. But with no proof of abuse at the hands of Joe, what other motive could Joyce have to have him killed? When questioned further, Mohammed reveals a key piece of information about his relationship with Joyce.
We learned that he had been actually selling prescription pills to Joyce.
In talking with Ali, she was taking a lot of the pills a day. She would do just about anything to satisfy her addiction.
To corroborate Mohammed's story, police sit down with Joyce's son, Little Joe, and his wife to see if they can shed some light on the Sturdivant's family life.
For the last 10 years, she's been embezzling from the company on a regular basis, sometimes to the tune of $3,000 and $4,000 a week.
She was buying quite a few pills. There were some people there at the shop that I'm sure she was giving money to.
Financial records of his transmission shop were not good. They owed a lot of back taxes, had a lot of debt, and seriously doubt Joe Sturdivant knew about that.
She just depleted the business of money. And that was her only way out, was to kill him.
Other than control of the business, control of the money, she got $92,000 life insurance.
Little Joe also confirms that the abuse allegations are a lie.
Was your dad abusive to your mom?
No. They had arguments back and forth, but they was not ever physically abusive.
Despite the circumstantial evidence pointing to Joyce as her husband's killer, investigators still don't have the smoking gun that places her in the room with Joe at the time of the murder.
We obviously didn't have the murder weapon, lacked a lot of physical evidence. The persistence in the case was very important.
These guys were persistent. It was a lengthy process.
After over 2 years searching for something substantial, detectives finally uncover a crucial piece of evidence obtained in the original investigation.
In reviewing the overall evidence that was found initially at the scene, the detective had enough insight into taking her clothes.
However, because Joyce was not initially a suspect, her clothes remained untested until February 17th, 2011.
We got a lab report from the Texas Department of Public Safety indicating that there was gunshot residue on Joyce Sturdivant's jacket.
Coupled with the circumstantial evidence, the gunshot residue gives detectives the ammunition they need to charge Joyce with Joe's murder. On March 16, 2011, they arrest her at the Sturdivant Auto Shop.
She couldn't believe that we were arresting her. You know, it had been so long, she thought she'd gotten away with it.
Joyce is charged with capital murder and attempted capital murder. Her bail is set at $1 million.
This didn't match what I'd seen in the past. I didn't see the dark side of her.
I mean, it was hurtful. She's my mom, but everything was still a shock.
If Joyce Sturdivant's arrest was shocking, her trial would be a full-blown circus, with Joyce herself in the center ring.
As soon as the cross-examination started, it was like the other Joyce came out.
By March of 2011, after evading prosecution for nearly 3 years, Joyce Sturdivant's murderous plot to kill her husband Joe has finally caught up to her.
All the evidence pointed to Joyce Sturdivant.
When the trial begins on November 28, 2011, prosecutors pace jurors through the day they say Joyce finally pulled the trigger.
She got up at the same time she normally does. But instead of telling her husband goodbye that morning, she shot him. And I believe after she shot him, at that point, I believe that's when Joyce Sturdivant realized he wasn't dead.
She thought that she had killed him when she shot him in the back. What we believe happened was that he was still breathing, and what she heard was a gurgling. When She went back in and finished him off, and that's when she shot him in the back of the head to finish the job.
She just went to work and acted like nothing ever happened. You know, it takes a pretty cold person just to be able to pull that off.
When it's their turn to counter, Joyce's defense team sticks to her original claim that Joe was the victim of a robbery gone awry. They also double down on the assertion that Joyce was a victim of abuse, and then call Joyce to the stand to tell the jury her story.
She took the stand and played the frail, you know, walking up there with a cane, and my poor husband was killed, and, you know, and I'm the one who found the body, and tried to really play up the sympathy.
But her testimony can't explain away the gunshot residue that proves she fired a weapon. Nor can it eliminate the sworn testimony of everyone Joyce tried to enlist in the murder of her husband.
Witnesses are very important, and without a lot of physical evidence, you're going to rely on a lot of the testimony from these people. And when their stories all come together and the story's all the same, it's definitely exciting for your case.
On December 2nd, 2011, the jury returns with their verdict.
The judge read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant. He kind of hesitated, and then he said, guilty of murder.
I did not see really any reaction from Mom whatsoever. And they took her away.
They assessed punishment at 30 years on the murder and 15 on the attempted capital murder. At her age, at 67, she'll spend the remainder of her life in the penitentiary.
Though most people in this small Texas town are convinced Joyce pulled the trigger, not everyone agrees about why.
I do think probably she got hooked on pain-killing drugs, and she just depleted the business of money.
I truly believe she had finally had enough with everything that had gone on through the years. When you get tired enough,
The night began like an ordinary summer evening in a small Missouri town. Then Cynthia Smith disappeared. She was 31 years old. She was a mother. She had 2 young sons. And on July 28th, still 1988, she left them with a babysitter before heading to a bar in Mount Vernon, Missouri. She never came back. 10 days later, her body was discovered in a rural cemetery near Pierce City. For more than 30 years, the case remained without an arrest. Then, in 2019, investigators reopened the murder investigation. A grand jury indicted a 65-year-old Pierce City man named Lawrence Gene Timmons. For a moment, it appeared the decades-old mystery had finally been cracked, but the story did not end with the arrest. In 2021, the murder charge was dismissed. The case that had seemed solved was suddenly surrounded by another layer of uncertainty. And that is what makes the Cynthia Smith case so disturbing. Because sometimes a cold case does not end when investigators finally put a name on a suspect. Sometimes that is when the hardest questions begin. On July 28th, still 1988, Cynthia's evening was supposed to be temporary. She had children waiting for her. She had made arrangements for them to stay with a babysitter. Then she went to Chequeress Restaurant and Bar in Mount Vernon. It was a place where people gathered, a place where friends could meet. A place where a woman could spend an ordinary evening without expecting that she was walking into the final hours of her life. According to investigators and later reporting, Cynthia was last seen leaving the establishment. She was reportedly accompanied by an unidentified man. Then she vanished. The babysitter was waiting for her to return, but Cynthia never came back for her son. That absence was the first alarm. At some point, the situation stopped looking like a woman who was simply late. Cynthia had disappeared, and her children were still waiting. A missing person report followed. Investigators began looking for her, but there was no immediate answer, no confirmed destination, no confirmed companion. No clear explanation for why a mother who had left her children with a babysitter would suddenly fail to return. The search moved outward. And then came the discovery that transformed the disappearance into a homicide investigation. Cynthia's body was found in the Dry Valley Cemetery area near Pierce City. The location was rural, the kind of place where darkness could swallow details. The body had been left roughly 5 miles northwest of Pierce City, according to local reporting. She had been missing for 10 days. Now investigators knew she was dead, but they still had to determine who had taken her life. The discovery changed the entire atmosphere around the cave. A missing woman became a murder victim. A family waiting for her return was forced to confront a reality nobody wanted to believe. Cynthia was not coming home. Her sons would grow up without her, and investigators were now facing a crime committed more than 3 decades before the eventual arrest. In 1988, detectives questioned people connected to the case. One of the names that eventually became significant was Lawrence Timmons, but no charges were filed against him at the time. The investigation continued. Then the leads slowed. The years began to accumulate. 1 year, 5 years, 10, 20, 30. The case became a cold case. Cynthia's name remained attached to an unsolved murder. The people who had known her grew older. Her children grew up. The investigators who had worked the original case moved on or retired. And whatever had happened on that summer night became buried beneath decades of silence. That is how a cold case survived. Not because nobody cared, because time creates distance. Evidence becomes harder to locate. Witnesses disappear. Memories fade. People move. And a case that once dominated conversations can eventually become a file sitting quietly in an evidence room. But Cynthia's case never completely disappeared. Someone kept looking. Someone kept remembering. And eventually, new information would bring it back. The breakthrough did not come from a dramatic confession at the original crime scene. It came decades later. In 2019, the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation after being contacted by a private investigation firm that had received new information. Investigators spent months examining that information. The evidence was eventually presented to the Lawrence County prosecutor. Then it went before a grand jury. On September 6, still 2019, the grand jury indicted Lawrence Timmons for murder. He was already in the Lawrence County Jail on unrelated charges. The arrest immediately transformed the case. After 31 years, there was finally an accused killer. The man investigators had questioned in 1988 was now facing a first-degree murder charge. The small communities surrounding Lawrence County suddenly had a case that had been dead for decades and suddenly appeared alive again. Timmons was 65 when he was indicted. Cynthia had been 31 when she died. The difference represented more than an age gap. It represented the enormous amount of time between the crime and the accusation. 31 years. A generation. Enough time for children to become adult. Enough time for the original investigators to retire. Enough time for the community itself to change. And yet the murder had not disappeared. The question was still there. Who killed Cynthia Smith? Now prosecutors believed they had an answer. But an indictment is not a conviction. It is an accusation supported by a grand jury's finding of probable cause. The case still had to survive in court. And that is where the story became far more complicated. Before that happened, investigators had already begun revisiting the events of July 28th, still 1988. The night Cynthia disappeared. The bar. The people who were there. The unidentified man. The people who knew Cynthia. The people who remembered seeing Timmons. One woman, Marilyn Chambers, later recalled the night. She had driven Cynthia to Chequerette. According to reporting about the investigation, Chambers remembered Timmons asking several women at the bar to dance. She remembered being uncomfortable. She remembered wanting to leave. And she remembered something Cynthia allegedly told her at the end of the night. Cynthia said Timmons was going to take her home. That recollection became part of the renewed investigation. If that memory was accurate, it placed Cynthia and Timmons together near the end of the evening. But memory is not the same thing as physical evidence. 31 years had passed. People remember differently after decades. Dates become uncertain. Conversations become blurred. And investigators must separate what a person clearly remembers from what they may have reconstructed over time. That is one of the greatest challenges in cold case investigation. The detective is not simply investigating the crime. The detective is investigating memory itself. And there was another complication. Timmons had already been known to law enforcement long before Cynthia disappeared. His criminal history included a 1976 kidnapping conviction involving an 11-year-old boy. According to later reporting, the boy was taken at gunpoint and held in Timmons's basement. Timmons served several years in prison for that offense. His history would later become part of the public discussion surrounding Cynthia's case. But investigators could not simply convict someone because of what happened years earlier. Past conduct is not proof of a separate murder. Every allegation has to be examined independently. Every piece of evidence has to stand on its own. And the renewed investigation had to establish what happened to Cynthia. Not what might have happened. Not what seemed likely. What could be proven. That distinction would eventually become crucial, because the 2019 indictment created a powerful headline. A 31-year-old Missouri murder case had finally produced an arrest. A cold case appeared to be cracked. A family might finally get answered. A community might finally know who had been responsible. But the courtroom would demand something stronger than headlines. It would demand admissible evidence. And prosecutors would eventually face a problem that no detective could solve with a theory. Witnesses were aging. Some were gone. Some memories were no longer available. And one of the most important witnesses connected to the prosecution's case was no longer alive. The case began to collide with the same force that had made it so difficult to solve in the first place. Time. Time had helped bury the murder. And now time was threatening the prosecution. Still, in 2019, none of that was obvious to the public. The arrest felt like the ending. For people who had waited more than 3 decades, seeing Timmons in custody must have seemed like the moment Cynthia's long silence was finally breaking. The woman who had disappeared after leaving her children with a babysitter now had a suspect attached to her case. The investigation had moved from uncertainty to accusation, and the story spread beyond the small communities of southwestern Missouri. A national true crime program, Cold Justice, became involved with the investigation. Its team worked with local authorities and examined the case. The investigation was later featured in an episode titled Small Town Predator. The renewed attention brought Cynthia's story back into the public eye. Her sons, now grown men, were able to speak about their mother. They were children when she disappeared. They had memories of her. Camping. Family life. The ordinary moments that remain after someone is suddenly gone. Those memories mattered. Because Cynthia was never just a murder victim. She was their mother. And the investigation had taken 31 years to reach the point where someone was finally accused of killing her. But the case still contained a brutal contradiction. The investigators now had a suspect. Yet the public did not have a final answer. Because a charge is not the same as justice. And an indictment is not the same as a conviction. The case still had to survive the legal system. The prosecution still had to prove its allegations. And the evidence collected more than 3 decades earlier had to withstand the passage of time. That was the next battle. The murder had happened in 1988. The indictment came in 2019. 31 years separated the two. The world had changed. The town had changed. The people had changed. But one question had not. What happened to Cynthia Smith after she left check arrest that night? And if Lawrence Timmons was responsible, could prosecutors still prove it after all those years? The answer would determine whether the arrest truly represented the end of the cold case or only another chapter in a mystery that had already survived 1 generation. Because beneath the headlines, beneath the indictment, beneath the renewed attention, Cynthia's family was still waiting for something more powerful than an arrest. They were waiting for certainty. And in a case that had already survived 31 years, certainty was about to become much harder to obtain. By the time Cynthia Smith's body was found, 10 days had passed. 10 days of unanswered calls. 10 days of uncertainty. 10 days in which a mother who had left her children with a babysitter had simply vanished. The discovery came on August 7th, still 1988, when Cynthia's body was located in the Dry Valley Cemetery area, roughly 5 miles northwest of Pierce City. The location was rural, away from the bar where she had last been seen in Mount Vernon. That distance mattered. Because investigators were no longer dealing with a woman who had simply disappeared from a familiar town. They were dealing with a victim whose final known location and burial site were separated by miles. Somewhere between those places was a missing story. A story that began late on July 28th. Cynthia had left her children with a babysitter. She went to Checkers in Mount Vernon. At some point during the early morning hours, she left the bar, and she was reportedly seen leaving with an unidentified man. Then everything went silent. The babysitter expected Cynthia to return. She did not. That failure to return was significant because Cynthia was a mother with responsibilities waiting at home. Her disappearance was not simply an unexplained absence from a social evening. Someone was expecting her. Her children were expecting her. But the door never opened. The next morning became a turning point. The missing person report was filed. Investigators began asking where Cynthia had gone. They retraced the night. They spoke with people who had seen her. They examined the last known location. And eventually, the search led investigators toward Pierce City. Then the body was found. The mystery had changed. There was no longer a question of whether Cynthia was missing. She was dead. Now investigators needed to know who had taken her life. In a small community, the discovery of a murdered woman could change the atmosphere almost instantly. People who had felt safe began looking at familiar roads differently. A cemetery that had once been simply a cemetery became associated with a murder. A bar became the last known location of a young mother. And ordinary people who had crossed paths with Cynthia suddenly wondered whether something they had seen or heard might matter. The investigation moved quickly. Authorities questioned numerous people. One of them was Lawrence Gene Timmons. He was not a stranger to investigators. But in 1988, questioning someone did not mean charging them. Timmons was questioned about Cynthia's death. No murder charge followed. The investigation continued without a definitive public resolution. And then another development placed Timmons back into the center of the story. 4 days after Cynthia's body was found, he was arrested on separate allegations involving rape, armed criminal action, and marijuana possession, according to later reporting about the case. He was eventually acquitted of the rape charge in March 1989, but the timing meant his name was already present in the investigative history surrounding Cynthia's death. Still, none of that established that he killed Cynthia. That point matters. An arrest on another allegation was not proof of murder. Being questioned was not proof of murder. Being associated with a victim was not proof of murder. Investigators needed evidence connecting a person to Cynthia's death. In 1988, that evidence was apparently not sufficient to produce a murder charge, so the case remained open. And then it began to age. 30 days became months. Months became years. Years became decades. Cynthia's children grew older. The community changed. The investigators changed. But the murder remained attached to a date. July 28th, still 1988. A night that had begun normally. A mother leaving her children with a babysitter. A trip to a local bar. A man walking out with her. Then nothing. The absence of an arrest created a vacuum. And cold cases always create vacuum. When facts disappear, speculation moves in. People begin asking what investigators missed. Was someone lying? Was someone protecting another person? Did a witness see more than they admitted? Was there evidence that could not be recovered? Was the original investigation simply unable to connect the pieces? Those questions can remain for decades. But investigators cannot solve a case through speculation. They need something concrete. And in Cynthia's case, the original investigation eventually reached a dead end. The file remained alive, but inactive. Then the world changed. Technology changed. Private investigators began using methods unavailable to detectives in 1988. Television programs began revisiting unsolved murder. Families began speaking publicly. Old cases began receiving new attention, and Cynthia's murder was eventually brought back into the spotlight. The program Cold Justice became involved in the investigation. Its team worked alongside local authorities. The renewed investigation examined information that had not previously produced an arrest. That effort eventually led investigators back toward Lawrence Timmons. The Lawrence County Sheriff's Office later said the cold case was reopened after a private investigation firm contacted the department with new information. Investigators spent months examining the information. The material was then presented to the Lawrence County prosecutor. The prosecutor took it to a grand jury. And on September 6th, still 2019, the grand jury indicted Timmons for first-degree murder. 31 years after Cynthia disappeared. 31 years after the body was discovered. 31 years after investigators first questioned Timmons. The headline practically wrote itself. A cold case had cracked. A suspect was finally behind bars. For Cynthia's family, the news had to carry a complicated mixture of emotions: hope, anger, relief, and uncertainty. Because an indictment is only the beginning of a criminal prosecution. It is not a conviction. The accusation still has to survive court. The evidence has to be admissible. Witnesses have to testify. The prosecution has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And in a case more than 3 decades old, every one of those requirements can become a battlefield. The prosecution's biggest enemy was not necessarily the defendant. It was time. Witnesses who remembered 1988 had lived through 31 additional years. Some had died. Some memories had faded. Some people who might once have been available to investigators were no longer there, and some evidence could not be recreated. That problem would eventually become decisive. But in September 2019, the public did not yet know how fragile the case would become. All they knew was that Lawrence Timmons had been indicted. He was 65 years old. He had already been in the Lawrence County Jail on unrelated charges. His bond in the murder case was set at $250,000. The small-town case that had been quiet for decades was suddenly national news, and the investigation itself contained another disturbing layer. Timmons had a criminal history that went back years before Cynthia's death. In 1976, he had been convicted in connection with the kidnapping and assault of an 11-year-old boy. That history would later become part of the public narrative surrounding the murder investigation. But again, history is not proof. The prosecution could not simply walk into court and say, "Look at what happened before. Therefore, he committed this murder." Criminal trials do not work that way. The evidence had to connect Timmons specifically to Cynthia's death, and that meant returning to the night of July 28th, the bar, the witnesses, the unidentified man, the route from Mount Vernon, the eventual discovery in Pierce City, the people Cynthia knew, the people Timmons knew. Every detail had to be examined. The investigation was essentially traveling backward through time, 31 years, back to a night when nobody knew they were standing at the beginning of a cold case. A witness might remember seeing Cynthia at the bar. Another might remember Timmons. Someone might remember a conversation. Someone else might remember a vehicle. But the investigators needed more than isolated memory. They needed a coherent chain. And that chain was fragile. Because the passage of time does something terrible to investigation. It removes certainty. A witness remembers something from 1988. But how precisely? Was it July 28th? Or another night? Was Cynthia wearing a particular outfit? Was the man beside her Timmons? Or someone who resembled him? Did she leave voluntarily? Did she appear frightened? Did anyone actually see what happened afterward? Those questions would matter enormously in court. The prosecution had to build a case strong enough to survive challenges, and the defense had every reason to attack the reliability of old memory. Timmons maintained his innocence. His attorney rejected the allegation. The legal battle began. The case was eventually moved out of Lawrence County because of concerns surrounding publicity. A change of venue transferred the murder proceedings to Jasper County. That decision reflected just how much attention the case had generated. A small Missouri murder from 1988 had become a nationally discussed cold case. People who had never heard Cynthia's name before were now hearing it. Television viewers watched investigators revisit the crime. News organizations reported on the indictment. Online discussions examined the evidence. The case was no longer buried. It was under a spotlight. And a spotlight can work in two directions. It can help investigators, but it can also expose weaknesses. Every claim is examined. Every witness is questioned. Every piece of evidence becomes vulnerable to scrutiny. The stronger the accusation becomes in public, the more carefully it must be tested in court. That distinction would become critical, because the case that appeared to be solved in 2019 would not end the way many people expected. For a while, however, there was reason to believe the prosecution could move forward. Timmons remained in custody. The investigation continued. The evidence was being prepared. Cynthia's family had finally seen an arrest. The community had finally seen movement. After 3 decades of silence, there was finally a courtroom attached to the case. But then the years that had already damaged the investigation began to exact their price. Witnesses died, and testimony that prosecutors had hoped to use became legally unavailable. One particularly important issue involved testimony from Timmons's former wife in Oklahoma. According to the Lawrence County prosecutor, A change in Missouri law affected whether testimony from a murdered person could be used at trial. Under the newer law, such testimony could be used against a defendant only under specific circumstances involving the purpose of the killing. The prosecutor said that requirement could not be met in this case. That legal change was devastating to the prosecution, but it was not the only problem. Other witnesses had also died. The case was losing the human evidence that investigators had relied upon, and without those witnesses, prosecutors feared they could no longer prove the murder charge. The irony was brutal. Time had helped create the cold case. Then time helped weaken the prosecution that finally reopened it. The same decades that made Cynthia's murder so difficult to solve were now making it difficult to prosecute. And suddenly, the arrest that had shocked the small town faced a new threat, the possibility that the murder charge might collapse. Not because investigators had proven Timmons innocent, not because Cynthia had somehow been found alive, not because the case had been solved in another direction, because the prosecution might no longer have enough admissible evidence to take the case to a successful trial. That distinction would become one of the most misunderstood aspects of the entire story. A dismissed charge does not automatically mean the defendant was exonerated, and an indictment does not mean guilt was proven. The legal system requires evidence capable of surviving in court. If that evidence disappears, a prosecutor may have no choice but to dismiss. That is precisely what eventually happened. But in 2019, nobody knew that yet. The case was still alive. Timmons was still facing first-degree murder charges. Cynthia's name was finally back in the headline. And somewhere beneath the legal arguments was the same unanswered question that had haunted Lawrence County since 1988. Who killed Cynthia Smith? The investigation had produced a suspect. The grand jury had issued an indictment. But the truth had not yet been established in court. And the closer the prosecution came to trial, the more the case began to reveal the terrible cost of waiting 31 years. Evidence can survive. Files can survive. Names can survive. But witnesses do not. Memories do not. People do not. And Cynthia's case was about to become a devastating example of what happens when justice arrives decades after the crime. The arrest had made the town believe the silence was finally ended. But the courtroom was about to ask a much harder question. Was there enough left from 1988 to prove what happened? And if there wasn't, could the most dramatic cold case breakthrough in Lawrence County disappear all over again? For 31 years, Cynthia Smith's murder existed in the space between suspicion and proof. There had been a victim. There had been a body. There had been witnesses. There had been a man investigators questioned in 1988, but there had been no murder charge. Then, in 2019, the case suddenly moved again. Lawrence Timmons was indicted by a Lawrence County grand jury for first-degree murder. The sheriff's office said the case had been reopened after a private investigation firm brought new information to investigators. After months of additional investigation, the information was presented to the prosecutor and then to the grand jury. The announcement was explosive. A murder that had remained unresolved since 1988 now had a defendant. But behind the headline was a far more complicated story, because investigators had not simply discovered a new crime scene. They had reopened an old one. They had to reconstruct a night that had happened more than 3 decades earlier. And the further they went back, the more they encountered the same problem. People had changed. People had moved. People had forgotten. Some had died. Evidence that once seemed ordinary had become impossible to recover. The case had survived. The witnesses had not. That was the danger. Cynthia was last seen on July 28th. Still 1988. Leaving Checkers Bar in Mount Vernon with an unidentified man. A babysitter later reported her missing after Cynthia failed to return for her children. 10 days later, her body was discovered in a cemetery near Pierce City. Those facts had never changed. But the meaning investigators attached to them could change as new information emerged. And that is exactly what happened when the cold case was reopened. The renewed investigation focused attention on Timmons. He had been questioned back in 1988. At the time, investigators had not charged him. Now they were looking at the same man through a different lens. 31 years had passed. New witnesses had emerged. Old information had been reconsidered. And investigators believed they had enough to take the case before a grand jury. The indictment did not erase the uncertainty. It intensified it. Because now every detail from 1988 had to withstand scrutiny. What happened at Checkers? Who was the unidentified man? Was Cynthia voluntarily leaving with him? Where did she go afterward? How did she end up in the cemetery? And what evidence connected Timmons to those events? The questions were simple. The answers were not. The renewed investigation eventually received national attention through cold justice. The case became the subject of the episode Small Town Predator, which aired in March 2020. The program brought Cynthia's story to a much wider audience and placed investigators' renewed work under public scrutiny. For people watching from outside Missouri, the case could look straightforward. A woman disappears. Her body is found. A man is suspected. Decades later, he is arrested. But criminal investigations are rarely that clean. The prosecution was not trying to tell the most convincing story. It was trying to prove the case. That meant evidence. Admissible evidence. Reliable testimony. Witnesses who could take the stand. And a change strong enough to survive cross-examination. The passage of 31 years had damaged every one of those things. One witness might remember Cynthia at the bar. Another might remember Timmons. Another might remember something said years earlier. But memories become vulnerable when decades pass. A witness can remember the event, but forget the exact date. A witness can remember a face but become uncertain about the circumstances. A witness can remember a conversation but struggle to remember the exact word. And when a case depends heavily on testimony, those uncertainties can become enormous. The prosecution knew it. The defense knew it. The judge knew it. And eventually, the case would come down to whether the remaining evidence could still support a first-degree murder prosecution. At first, the prosecution appeared determined to move forward. Timmons remained charged. The case received a change of venue because of the publicity surrounding the investigation. The murder proceedings were moved to Jasper County. The story had become too well known in Lawrence County for the defense to believe a fair trial could easily take place there. Contemporary reporting described the extensive publicity surrounding the case and the eventual transfer of venue. The courtroom was now waiting. But the courtroom was not 1988. That was the problem. In 1988, investigators could interview a witness and record a statement. 30 years later, that witness might not be available. A statement may exist, but depending on the circumstances, a statement is not always a substitute for live testimony. A prosecutor cannot simply place every old memory into evidence. The law decides what a jury can hear, and the law had changed since Cynthia's murder. That change would eventually become one of the most important facts in the entire case. But before that happened, investigators had to confront another painful reality. Some of the witnesses they needed were dead. That meant the passage of time had done something irreversible. It had removed voices from the investigation. A person who once knew something about Cynthia could no longer testify. A person who might have remembered the events could no longer be questioned. The case had been waiting for justice, but justice had been waiting for witnesses, and witnesses were disappearing. This is the cruel mathematics of a cold case. Every year that passes creates another possibility. A witness dies. A memory fades. A document is lost. A location changes. A suspect ages. A detective retires. An investigator who knew the original file dies without being able to explain what was never written down. 31 years is enough time for an entire generation to disappear from the investigation, and Cynthia's case had reached exactly that point. The prosecution still believed Timmons was responsible. Lawrence County prosecutor Don Trotter later said he believed Timmons had murdered Cynthia. But belief is not the legal standard. The prosecutor needed evidence that could be presented in court. That distinction became decisive. Timmons's attorney maintained his client's innocence. The defense did not have to prove an alternative story. The prosecution carried the burden, beyond a reasonable doubt. That burden does not become smaller because the crime is old. It becomes harder to meet. And the older the case becomes, the more fragile the evidence can become. For Cynthia's family, that must have been an agonizing position. They had waited 31 years for an arrest. Now they had one. But an arrest does not answer every question. It does not prove what happened. It does not guarantee a conviction. It does not guarantee that the case will even reach a trial. It only means the legal system has moved to another stage. The family had spent decades without knowing whether anyone would ever be held responsible. Now they were suddenly watching court proceedings, watching lawyers, watching motions, watching evidence, watching the same old murder become a legal battle. And the more the prosecution examined its case, the clearer the problem became. The evidence depended heavily on witnesses, and some of those witnesses were no longer alive. One particular piece of evidence became especially important. It involved testimony connected to Timmons's former wife. The details were complicated, but the legal issue was simple. Could prosecutors use testimony from someone who was now dead? A change in Missouri law made the answer much more difficult. The new statute limited when testimony from a murdered person could be used against a defendant. According to prosecutor Don Trotter, the law required that the person had been killed specifically to prevent them from testifying. That was not something prosecutors could establish in Cynthia's case. That legal change struck at the prosecution's case. A witness who might once have been available as evidence was now effectively removed from the courtroom. And the problem did not stop there. 2 other witnesses connected to the case had also died. Without their testimony, the prosecutor said there was not enough evidence to proceed. The case that had appeared so strong from the outside was suddenly in danger. The public had seen the arrest. They had not seen the legal weaknesses underneath it. This is one of the most misunderstood realities of cold case prosecution. An investigation can uncover enough information to convince detectives that someone is responsible. But that does not necessarily mean there is enough admissible evidence to convict that person. Those are 2 completely different standards. Investigators can believe. Prosecutors can believe. Families can believe. But a jury must be shown evidence. And that evidence must meet the rules of the courtroom. The case against Timmons was now caught between 2 worlds. The investigative world said, "We have new information." The legal world asked, "Can you prove it?" The investigation had moved forward. The prosecution was moving backward. It was losing pieces. Witnesses. Testimony. Time. And suddenly, the headline from 2019 began to look very different. The cold case had been cracked. But had it actually been solved? That question became impossible to ignore, because a solved murder should have a conclusion, a victim, a perpetrator, evidence, a conviction. Cynthia had the first part. Timmons had been accused of the second, but the third and fourth remained uncertain. The grand jury indictment had established that prosecutors had enough information to bring the charge. It did not establish guilt. That distinction would remain central. Then came December 2021. After more than 2 years of prosecution, the first-degree murder charge was dismissed. Not because a court had found Timmons innocent, not because Cynthia's death was suddenly explained. The prosecutor dismissed the charge because the available evidence was no longer sufficient to move forward. The dismissal was without prejudice. That meant the case could potentially be filed again if new evidence emerged. The headline changed overnight. The man arrested in a 31-year-old murder case was no longer facing the murder charge. The dramatic cold case breakthrough had collapsed. But the story was not over. Because dismissal without prejudice is not an exoneration. It is not a declaration that Timmons did not kill Cynthia. It simply means the prosecution was unable to continue with the charge under the circumstances that existed at that time. And that left the central mystery untouched. Who killed Cynthia Smith? The answer remained legally unresolved. The case had traveled from 1988 to 2019, then from 2019 to 2021, and now it had returned to uncertainty. But something had changed. The investigation had exposed information that had not been available before. People had talked. Records had been examined. The case had received national attention. The public knew Cynthia's name again, and investigators had shown that the file could still be reopened. That mattered. Because a cold case is not necessarily dead simply because a prosecution failed. Evidence can appear later. A witness can come forward. A document can surface. Technology can change. A person can decide to speak. The case can move again. But Cynthia's family had already waited more than 3 decades. The possibility of waiting again was devastating. The murder had become a story about time. And time had already taken so much. It had taken witnesses. It had taken memories. It had taken investigators. It had taken Cynthia's children through childhood and into adulthood without their mother. And now it had taken away the prosecution that had once appeared to promise an ending. The small Missouri communities surrounding Mount Vernon and Pierce City had seen the case rise from the dead. Then they watched it fall back into uncertainty. The cemetery remained. The bar was gone or changed. The people who had been there in 1988 were older. Some were gone. Some were silent. And somewhere inside those surviving memories could still be the answer. But the case had demonstrated something brutal. Finding a suspect is not the same as proving a murder. Finding a story is not the same as establishing the truth. And bringing an indictment after 31 years does not guarantee that the courtroom will accept what investigators believe happened. Cynthia's disappearance began with a mother failing to return to her children. It ended with her body in a rural cemetery. Between those 2 points was an entire night that investigators have spent decades trying to reconstruct. The renewed investigation brought that night back into focus. The indictment put a name on the accusation. The dismissal removed the charge. But it did not erase the questions. If anything, the questions became sharper. What exactly happened after Cynthia left Checkers? Who was the man seen leaving with her? What happened between Mount Vernon and Pierce City? And why did it take 31 years for the investigation to reach its most dramatic breakthrough? Those questions remain the heart of the case. And somewhere in the surviving evidence, the answer may still exist, because Cynthia Smith did not disappear into history. Her case simply became buried beneath it. And now, decades later, investigators are left with the hardest task of all, separating what they know from what they believe, separating the accusation from the proof, and searching through the remaining fragments of 1988 for the one piece of evidence that could finally tell the story of what happened to Cynthia Smith. The charge was gone, but Cynthia Smith was still dead. That was the brutal reality left behind after the dramatic 2019 arrest began to unravel. Lawrence Timmons had been indicted for first-degree murder in the 1988 killing, but by December 2021, prosecutors had dismissed the charge without prejudice. The reason was not a finding that Timmons had been innocent. Prosecutors said the available evidence was no longer sufficient to proceed, particularly after witnesses died and changes in Missouri law affected what testimony could be used. For Cynthia's family, that distinction could feel almost meaningless. A courtroom had promised an answer. Now the courtroom was silent again. 33 years had passed since Cynthia disappeared. 33 years since she left her children with a babysitter. 33 years since she went to Checkers restaurant and bar in Mount Vernon. 33 years since she was reportedly seen leaving with an unidentified man. And now, after all that time, the man accused of killing her was no longer facing the murder charge. The case had gone almost exactly where cold cases are never supposed to go. From silence, to breakthrough, to arrest, then back to uncertainty. But the investigation had uncovered something important. The original case had never been as empty as it appeared. There had been witnesses. There had been memories. There had been people who remembered Cynthia. And there had been people who remembered Lawrence Timmons. The problem was that those pieces had spent decades scattered across time. One of the people who remembered Cynthia was Marilyn Chambers. She had driven Cynthia to Checkers on the night she disappeared. That detail placed her close to the beginning of Cynthia's final known journey. According to reporting about the investigation, Chambers later recalled seeing Timmons at the bar and remembered him asking women to dance. She also remembered wanting to leave, and she remembered Cynthia saying that Timmons was going to take her home. That memory became significant when investigators reopened the case decades later, because suddenly, a name that had existed in the original investigation was being connected again to Cynthia's final hour. But memories from 1988 had to survive a brutal test. 31 years. That is an enormous amount of time. A person can remember the emotional intensity of a night while losing the precise details. A face can remain familiar while the circumstances surrounding it become blurred. A conversation can survive in someone's mind while the exact words change. That is why investigators could not simply accept every recollection. They had to compare, cross-check, verify, separate what could be established from what could only be remembered. And this was where the case became increasingly complicated. The prosecution needed to prove what happened to Cynthia. It needed to establish a connection between Timmons and the murder, and it needed evidence strong enough to survive the courtroom. The 2019 grand jury indictment had established that prosecutors had enough information to bring the case. The indictment accused Timmons of deliberately causing Cynthia's death by striking her, according to contemporary reporting. But the indictment was not the final word. It was the beginning of the legal battle. Timmons maintained his innocence. His defense attorney rejected the allegation, and once the case moved toward trial, every piece of evidence came under pressure. The defense could question old memory. It could challenge witnesses. It could challenge the reliability of information gathered decades earlier. It could point to gaps, and there were gaps. Huge ones. The exact circumstances between Cynthia leaving the bar and the discovery of her body remained difficult to reconstruct. The location of her body was known. The beginning of the night was partly known. The middle was the mystery. That missing middle was where the truth had to be found. The road from Mount Vernon toward Pierce City suddenly became more than geography. It became the invisible corridor of the investigation. Somewhere along that timeline, Cynthia stopped being a woman heading home and became a homicide victim. Investigators knew the ending. They had to reconstruct the journey. The body was discovered in a dirt lane leading to Dry Valley Cemetery, approximately 5 miles northwest of Pierce City. The location was rural, quiet, far removed from the public atmosphere of a bar. That contrast made the case even more difficult. Cynthia had last been seen in a social environment. Then she was found in a secluded location. What happened between those 2 points? That question remained, and every possible answer depended on evidence that was more than 3 decades old. The original investigators had questioned Timmons in 1988. No murder charge followed. That fact would later become one of the most important pieces of the timeline, because when investigators reopened the case in 2019, they were not discovering Timmons for the first time. They were returning to someone already present in the original investigation. The difference was that investigators now had new information. The Lawrence County Sheriff's Office said the cold case was reopened after a private investigation firm contacted authorities with new information. After several months of investigation, the information was presented to prosecutor Don Trotter, who took it before a grand jury. The grand jury indicted Timmons on September 6, still 2019. That sequence matters. The arrest was not random. It was the result of a reopened investigation. But the later dismissal showed how different investigative suspicion is from courtroom proof. The prosecution eventually said it could no longer proceed. One of the biggest problems involved Timmons's former wife in Oklahoma. Prosecutors had hoped to use her testimony, but she had been murdered. A change in Missouri law altered the circumstances under which testimony from a murdered person could be admitted against a defendant. According to prosecutor Trotter, the law required prosecutors to establish that the defendant killed the witness specifically to prevent that person from testifying. That could not be established in Cynthia's case, so that testimony was unavailable. Then came another blow. 2 other witnesses connected to the case had died. The evidence was shrinking. Not because investigators had proven their information false, because the people who carried that information were no longer alive to testify. That is the terrible mathematics of a decades-old murder. The longer the investigation waits, the more fragile human evidence becomes. A witness can die. A witness can develop dementia. A witness can disappear. A witness can become impossible to locate. A witness can remember less. And a witness who is dead cannot be brought into court to answer questions. The case becomes dependent on whatever evidence remains legally usable. That is why cold cases can be solved decades later but still fail to produce a conviction. The investigation and the courtroom operate under different rules. Detectives can follow leads. Prosecutors need admissible evidence. The difference is enormous. And Cynthia's case exposed that difference in the harshest possible way. For a moment, the community had believed the mystery was ended. Timmons had been indicted. The cold case had returned to the headlines. The investigation had been featured on Cold Justice. Cynthia's family had finally seen movement. Then the prosecution collapsed. In December 2021, the charge was dismissed without prejudice. That phrase matters. Without prejudice meant the case was not necessarily closed forever. If new evidence were discovered, prosecutors could potentially bring the murder charge again. So the door was not locked. It was left open. Barely, but open. And that meant Cynthia's murder remained unresolved. The accusation against Timmons was no longer active, but the investigation had not produced another confirmed explanation. The identity of the person responsible for Cynthia's death remained legally unsettled. The case had returned to the same fundamental question that had existed since 1988. Who killed Cynthia Smith? The answer could not be supplied by the dismissal. The dismissal only told investigators what they could not prove under the circumstances that existed in 2021. That left the possibility of future evidence. And future evidence is exactly what cold case detectives hope for. A witness who finally talks. A document that appears. A forgotten photograph. A confession. A physical item that can be tested with modern forensic technology. or information that someone has carried for decades without realizing it's important. But there was another part of the story that made the case even more complicated. Timmons did not simply disappear after the murder charge was dropped. He remained involved in the legal system on unrelated charges. According to local reporting, he continued to face firearm possession and forgery charges. He had originally been booked into the Lawrence County Jail in August 2019 on those unrelated allegations before the murder indictment was issued. The murder case had collapsed, but the other charges remained. That meant Timmons's name stayed in court record. The community continued to hear it. The story did not completely disappear. And for investigators, that mattered, because a cold case is easier to reopen when the people connected to it remain alive and identifiable. The passage of time had already destroyed some evidence, but not everything was gone. Records survived. The original investigation survived. The location survived. The memories of surviving witnesses survived. And most importantly, Cynthia's story survived. Her family continued to remember her. That is something cold cases cannot erase. A police file can become forgotten. A newspaper can become yellowed. A witness can move away. But a mother remains a mother. Cynthia's children had been young when she disappeared. They had grown up with a question that had no answer. Where did their mother go? Now, decades later, they had learned that she had been murdered. They had also watched the man accused of killing her walk into the legal system. Then they watched the charge disappear. That kind of uncertainty is different from the uncertainty of the original disappearance. In 1988, the family did not know where Cynthia was. In 2019, they knew she had died and someone had been accused. In 2021, they were left with another question. If the charge was dismissed, what happens now? The law had spoken, but the murder itself remained. And that is the emotional core of a cold case. The legal system can close a courtroom. It cannot close a family member's memory. Cynthia was still missing from the lives of the people who loved her. Her children were still without their mother. The cemetery where her body had been found was still part of the history. And the night at Checkers still remained the final known chapter before the mystery began. The unidentified man remained one of the most haunting details. Someone had reportedly been seen leaving with Cynthia. Who was he? Was he really the last person to see her alive? What did he know? Was he ever properly identified? Did investigators in 1988 know his name? And if they did, what happened to that information? Those questions are precisely the kind of questions that can survive for decades. But they must be answered with records and evidence, not speculation. The public record does not establish a definitive account of that man's identity or his role in Cynthia's death. That uncertainty must remain. The same is true for Timmons. He was indicted. He was accused. He was never convicted of Cynthia's murder. The charge was dismissed without prejudice. His attorney said he maintained his innocence. That means the story cannot honestly end with the statement that Timmons killed Cynthia. The evidence did not reach that legal conclusion. What can be said is that investigators eventually believed they had enough information to accuse him formally. Then prosecutors determined that they could not proceed with the murder case using the evidence that remained. That is the factual boundary. Everything beyond it is unresolved. And unresolved does not mean unimportant. It means unfinished. The investigation had already demonstrated that a 30-year-old case could suddenly move. The private investigation firm brought new information. The sheriff's office reopened the case. The prosecutor presented the evidence to a grand jury. An indictment followed. That entire chain happened after decades of silence. So another breakthrough is possible. It may take years. It may never happen. But the possibility remains. Because the case was not destroyed. It was interrupted. And there is a difference. The evidence that failed to support prosecution in 2021 does not necessarily represent every piece of evidence that could ever exist. A future witness could change the picture. A future forensic test could change it. A future record could change it. A future confession could change everything. And that is why the phrase, "without prejudice," matters so much. The legal door remained open. Somewhere beyond that door is the answer Cynthia's family has been waiting for since 1988. Not an indictment. Not a television episode. Not a headline. An answer. What happened after Cynthia left Checkers? Who took her away from that night? Who brought her to the cemetery? And why did the truth remain buried for so long? Those questions are still alive. And unlike Cynthia's body, which was eventually found, the truth about her final hours has remained hidden. For more than 3 decades, the investigation has moved through different hands, different detectives, different prosecutors, different technologies, different witnesses. But the same name remains at the center: Cynthia Smith, a mother, a daughter, a friend, a woman who left her children with a babysitter one night in July 1988. She expected to return. She never did. 10 days later, her body was found near Pierce City. 31 years after that, a man was indicted. 2 years after that, the murder charge was dismissed. And now the case sits in a strange place. Not solved, not forgotten, not completely closed. Waiting. Because somewhere in the surviving fragments of that summer night may still be the evidence that investigators need. And if that evidence ever surfaces, the headline will change again. Not cold, case cracked. Not arrest shocks, small town. But something far more powerful. The truth about Cynthia Smith is finally known. The murder charge was dismissed. But the investigation had left behind something that could not be dismissed so easily. A name, a timeline, a collection of witness memories, and a question that had survived since the summer of 1988. What happened to Cynthia Smith after she walked out of Checkers? The answer had never been established in court. That distinction became especially important after Lawrence Timmons was indicted in September 2019, and the charge was later dismissed in December 2021. Prosecutor Don Trotter said the case could potentially be filed again if new evidence emerged. That meant the file was not necessarily finished. It was simply back in the shadow. And cold cases have a strange way of remaining alive there. Cynthia's story began with an ordinary decision. She left her children with a babysitter. She went out. She went to Checkers in Mount Vernon. At some point, she was seen leaving with a man whose identity became one of the unresolved pieces of the investigation. Then she disappeared. The babysitter reported her missing after she failed to return. 10 days later, investigators found her body in a rural cemetery near Pierce City. Those facts are not speculation. They form the backbone of the case. Everything else has to be measured against them. And the further investigators traveled into the past, the more difficult that measurement became. The original investigation had been extensive. The Lawrence County Sheriff's Office had opened an inquiry in 1988. Investigators questioned people who knew Cynthia. They questioned people who had been around the bar. They questioned Lawrence Timmons. But no murder charge followed. For decades, the case remained unresolved. Then a private investigation firm brought new information to the sheriff's office. That was the trigger for the 2019 reopening. Investigators spent months examining the information. Eventually, it was turned over to the prosecutor. The prosecutor presented it to a grand jury. On September 6, SIL 2019, the grand jury indicted Timmons. For the public, that sequence created the impression of a mystery finally solved. But investigators were still reconstructing the past. And reconstruction is never the same as witnessing. Nobody could go back to the night of July 28, SIL 1988. Nobody could replay the conversation. Nobody could photograph the roads as they looked that night. Nobody could ask Cynthia what she had been thinking when she left the bar. She was gone. The only thing left was evidence. And evidence has limits. A witness might remember a face. A document might confirm a date. A photograph might establish a location. But none of those things necessarily explains what happened in the missing hour. That missing stretch remained the heart of the mystery. Cynthia left Checkers. Then she was found near Pierce City. Somewhere between those points was the event that transformed her from a missing mother into a homicide victim. And investigators had to bridge that gap. One of the most important recollections came from Marilyn Chambers. Chambers had driven Cynthia to Checkers. She remembered being there. She remembered Timmons. She later recalled Cynthia saying that Timmons was going to take her home. That memory helped investigators reconstruct the final known movements. But it also created another question. If Cynthia intended to go home, why did she end up miles away? Was she ever actually headed home? Did something happen after she left the bar? Did she change her plans? Was she forced to go somewhere? Or did the person who was with her have a completely different intention? The evidence publicly available does not establish every step. That is precisely why the case remained difficult. A cold case is not a puzzle where every piece has a hidden matching slot. Sometimes, pieces are simply missing. Sometimes investigators know what happened before the gap and what happened after it, but not what happened inside it. That was Cynthia's case. and the gap lasted decades. The public also learned more about Timmons's background during the renewed investigation. He had a previous felony conviction involving the kidnapping of an 11-year-old boy in 1976. That history made the accusation against him especially disturbing. But it was not proof that he killed Cynthia. That distinction must remain clear. A person's criminal history cannot substitute for evidence in another case. The prosecution had to establish Cynthia's murder independently, and that requirement became increasingly difficult as witnesses disappeared. Some witnesses who might have helped prosecutors were dead by the time the case returned to court. One was Timmons's former wife in Oklahoma. Her testimony had been considered important to the prosecution, but she had been murdered. A change in Missouri law meant prosecutors could not simply use her testimony against Timmons unless they could establish that he had killed her specifically to prevent her from testifying. Prosecutor Trotter said they could not make that showing. That was a devastating legal obstacle. Then there were other witnesses. They were gone too. And with them went testimony prosecutors believed they needed. The case was becoming a battle against absence. Cynthia had been absent in 1988. Now witnesses were absent in 2021. The pattern was almost cruel. Every stage of the investigation seemed to be defined by someone who was no longer there. Cynthia could not tell investigators what happened. The witnesses could not all testify. The defendant denied responsibility, and the prosecutor could not replace missing evidence with certainty. That is why the charge was eventually dismissed. The prosecutor said there was not enough evidence to convict. The dismissal was without prejudice. So the possibility of another prosecution remained if new evidence emerged. That single legal phrase left the story suspended. Not solved. Not closed forever. Suspended. And that meant the original question returned. Who killed Cynthia Smith? It is tempting in a story like this to force an ending, to take the strongest suspicion and present it as fact. But the surviving record does not allow that. Timmons was accused. He was indicted. He was never convicted of Cynthia's murder. The charge was dismissed. His attorney said Timmons maintained his innocence, so the responsible account has to leave room for what remains unknown. That does not make the story less disturbing. It makes it more disturbing, because Cynthia's family still does not have the certainty that a conviction would have provided. There was an arrest. There was national attention. There was a television investigation. There was a grand jury indictment. And still there was no final courtroom answer. For decades, Cynthia's sons had grown older while the case remained unresolved. The children who once waited for their mother became adults. Their memories of her became memories from childhood. And the woman they remembered became a photograph in a case file. That is another hidden cost of a cold case. The victim ages in everyone's memory without actually aging. Cynthia remains 31. Forever. Her children continue through decades that she never experienced. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every family milestone. Every moment when someone might instinctively think, I should call Mom. But Cynthia could not answer. She had been taken from the future, and the investigation could not give that future back. It could only search for the truth about the past. The location where her body was discovered became permanently attached to the investigation. Dry Valley Cemetery. A quiet rural setting. 5 miles northwest of Pierce City. A place that might otherwise have been nothing more than a name on a map. Instead, it became the final known destination in one of the region's most haunting murder cases. And that location raises another question. Why there? Why that cemetery? Was it selected randomly? Did the person responsible know the area? Was the location familiar? Was it chosen because it was isolated? The public record does not provide definitive answers to those questions. That silence is important, because every unanswered detail creates room for theory. But theories are not evidence. A responsible retelling has to resist the temptation to fill every gap. The mystery is frightening precisely because the gaps remain. There is no confirmed account of every moment after Cynthia left Checkers. There is no conviction establishing who killed her. There is no publicly established explanation that resolves every uncertainty. What exists is a documented timeline, and inside that timeline are unanswered questions. The first is the simplest. Who was the man seen leaving with Cynthia? The second is harder. What happened after they left? The third is harder still. Why did Cynthia's life end in a cemetery 10 days before her body was discovered? And the final question is the one her family has carried for decades. Why? Why Cynthia? Why that night? Why did she never return to her children? Those questions cannot be answered by a headline. They cannot be answered by an indictment. And they cannot be answered by a dismissed charge. They require evidence. The kind of evidence that can survive decades. The kind that can withstand cross-examination. The kind that can finally turn suspicion into fact. The 2019 investigation showed that new information could still emerge. That matters, because before 2019, Cynthia's case had spent decades without an indictment. Then something changed. A private investigation firm contacted authorities. The sheriff's office reopened the case. Investigators worked for months. The prosecutor presented the evidence to a grand jury. And suddenly, the cold case was active again. That sequence proves something important. 30 years did not destroy every lead. Some information survived. Some memories survived. Some records survived. The question is whether enough survives to produce a definitive answer. And that is where the case remains suspended. A prosecutor can dismiss a charge. A judge can close a hearing. A defendant can walk out of jail. But none of those things changes what happened to Cynthia. She was still murdered. Her body was still found. Her children still lost their mother. The unanswered questions still exist. And somewhere in the surviving evidence, there may still be a detail that nobody recognized as important in 1988. A detail overlooked. A name. A statement. A document. A memory. Something that seemed insignificant at the time. Cold cases often turn on details that were once considered ordinary. The detective who wrote down a name. The witness who remembers one sentence. The photograph nobody examined closely. The record sitting inside an archive. The person who finally decides that silence has lasted long enough. That possibility remains. Because the dismissal in 2021 did not erase the investigation. It did not declare the case solved in another direction. It simply meant prosecutors could not continue under the evidence and legal circumstances that existed at that moment. And that leaves Cynthia's story in an unsettling place. The case has a victim. It has a known date. It has a known discovery site. It has a documented investigation. It has a former defendant. But it does not have the one thing a murder case ultimately needs: a final judicial answer. The small towns around Mount Vernon and Pierce City have lived with that absence for decades. People who remember Cynthia are now older. Some are gone. New generations know her only through photographs, records, and stories. But the case remains attached to the same summer night. July 28th. Sill, 1988. A mother leaves her children with a babysitter. She goes to a bar. She is seen leaving with a man. She disappears. 10 days later, her body is found. 31 years later, an indictment. 2 years later, dismissal. And after all those years, the central mystery remains. The last confirmed moments of Cynthia Smith's life are still surrounded by darkness. Not because investigators stopped looking, because time kept taking pieces away. And as long as those missing pieces remain missing, the case cannot truly be called solved. The headline may have once said that the cold case was cracked. But Cynthia's family needed something more than a headline. They needed the truth. And somewhere, perhaps in an old memory that has never been spoken aloud, or in evidence that has not yet been fully understood, that truth may still be waiting. The murder charge was gone, but the questions had not disappeared with it. By the end of 2021, Cynthia Smith's case had entered an unusual state. Lawrence Timmons was no longer facing the first-degree murder charge connected to Cynthia's death, but the dismissal was without prejudice. Prosecutor Don Trotter said the case could potentially be brought again if new evidence emerged. That single detail kept the door open. Barely, but open. For a case that had already survived more than 3 decades, that mattered. Because the investigation had demonstrated something important. The file was not empty. It had never been empty. There were records. There were witnesses. There were memories. There were unanswered statements from 1988. And there was the strange path the investigation had taken from a missing person report to a homicide investigation, from a decades-old file to a television documentary, and finally to a grand jury indictment. But there was still no conviction. No courtroom verdict declaring who killed Cynthia. No final explanation for what happened after she left Checkers. The silence remained. And the longer investigators looked backward, the more complicated the timeline became. Cynthia was 31 years old when she disappeared. She had children. She had left them with a babysitter. She went to Checkers in Mount Vernon. Then, In the early morning hours of July 28, still 1988, she was seen leaving the establishment with an unidentified man. She did not return. A babysitter reported her missing after she failed to come back for her children. 10 days later, Cynthia's body was found in a dirt lane leading to Dry Valley Cemetery, about 5 miles northwest of Pierce City. That was the known timeline. Everything after that depended on evidence, and evidence had become the most fragile part of the case. The original investigators had questioned Lawrence Timmons in 1988. They did not charge him with Cynthia's murder. That fact remained buried in the history of the investigation until the case was reopened more than 30 years later. When the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office announced the 2019 indictment, it explained that the cold case had been reopened after a private investigation firm contacted authorities with new information. Investigators spent months examining that information. Then the evidence was presented to the prosecutor. The prosecutor took it to a grand jury. On September 6, still 2019, the grand jury indicted Timmons. He was 65 years old. He was already in the Lawrence County Jail on unrelated charges. The case that had been dormant since 1988 was suddenly moving again. And suddenly, Cynthia's name was everywhere. A mother who had been reduced to a cold case file was once again being discussed publicly. The investigation became the subject of Cold Justice. The episode, titled Small Town Predator, aired in March 2020. The program brought renewed attention to the case and to the investigators attempting to reconstruct what had happened more than 3 decades earlier. For viewers, the story seemed to have a clear direction. A missing mother, a body discovered in a rural cemetery, a suspect questioned in 1988, a new investigation, a grand jury indictment. The pieces appeared to be falling into place. A television could compress 31 years into an hour. The courtroom could not. The courtroom demanded proof. And proof was exactly where the passage of time became dangerous. The prosecution's case depended heavily on witnesses. Witnesses were people. People age. People move. People forget. And eventually, people die. That last fact would become decisive. As prosecutors prepared to move forward, they discovered that 2 witnesses connected to the case had died. Their testimony was gone. There was no way to put them back on the witness stand. No way to ask them questions. No way to challenge their memory. No way to let a jury hear their voices. The prosecutor later explained that the case was already missing evidence when the investigation began, and losing additional witnesses made it impossible to continue confidently. That was the hidden enemy of the prosecution. Not necessarily a lack of suspicion, a lack of surviving evidence. 33 years had passed, and the investigation was paying the price. The case had waited too long. Or perhaps more accurately, justice had been forced to operate inside a case that had waited too long. Then another legal obstacle appeared. The prosecution had hoped to use testimony from Timmons's former wife in Oklahoma, but she had been murdered. A change in Missouri law had created a problem. Under the newer statute, testimony from someone who had been murdered could be used against a defendant only under specific circumstances. Prosecutor Trotter said prosecutors would have needed to establish that the defendant killed that person specifically to prevent them from testifying. That was not what investigators believed had happened in the Oklahoma case. So the testimony could not provide the prosecution with the support it had expected. The result was devastating. One witness was unavailable because she was dead. 2 other witnesses were dead. The case was losing the very people who could have helped explain it. The prosecution had reached a point where it could no longer rely on everything investigators had gathered. That is the difference between an investigation and a trial. A detective can listen to someone explain what they remember. A prosecutor must determine whether that information can legally become evidence. The distinction can destroy a cold case, and Cynthia's case was now caught directly inside that distinction. The public had seen the indictment, but the indictment was only an accusation. It was not a verdict. The grand jury had found sufficient grounds to issue the charge. A trial would still have required the prosecution to prove Timmons's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and Timmons's attorney, Adam Woody, said his client had always maintained his innocence. That meant the prosecution had to build its case against a defendant who denied responsibility, using evidence more than 30 years old, with important witnesses no longer available. It was a dangerous legal position. The defense did not have to prove who killed Cynthia. The defense did not have to solve the murder. The prosecution carried the burden. and the burden was enormous. The case eventually faced a change of venue because of the publicity surrounding the indictment. The proceedings were moved from Lawrence County to Jasper County. That decision reflected the level of attention the case had received after Timmons was charged. Contemporary reporting later noted that the murder case was moved to Carthage because of the amount of publicity surrounding the prosecution. A courtroom hundreds of miles away might have been different, but the evidence was still the same. The witnesses were still dead. The memories were still old. The missing pieces were still missing. Changing the courtroom could not change 1988. That was the central problem. No judge could send investigators back to July 28th, still 1988. No lawyer could bring Cynthia back to explain her final movements. No prosecutor could ask the unidentified man who left the bar with her what happened afterward. The only way forward was through the evidence that remained. And the remaining evidence was being tested piece by piece. The case became less about what investigators believed and more about what they could prove. That is a difficult transition in any prosecution. It is even more difficult when a case has been dormant for decades. In the beginning, a detective can follow instinct. A detective can ask questions. A detective can look for inconsistency. A detective can develop a suspect. But eventually, the investigation must become a legal case. The suspect must be connected to the crime. The connection must be supported. The evidence must be admissible. And the jury must be able to understand it. Cynthia's case had reached that final stage after more than 30 years. The clock had already done enormous damage. Now the legal system had to determine whether enough remained. The answer was eventually no. But before the charge disappeared, there was another painful reality. The family had waited all those years. They had watched investigators come and go. They had watched the case become cold. Then they watched it become active again. For a brief period, they had reason to believe there might finally be a trial. A trial could have brought testimony into the open. Witnesses could have told their story. The defense could have challenged them. The prosecution could have presented its evidence. A jury could have decided whether the accusation was proven. Instead, the case stopped before reaching that final judgment. In December 2021, Trotter dismissed the murder charge. The prosecutor said the case simply did not have enough evidence to move forward. And once again, Cynthia's family was left with uncertainty. The difference was that now they had seen how close the case had come. The 2019 indictment had shown that the investigation could still produce a suspect. The 2021 dismissal showed how difficult it was to convert that investigation into a conviction. The case had reached the edge of resolution, then stepped back. That is perhaps the most haunting part of the story. For decades, Cynthia's family had feared that nobody would ever be held responsible. Then, for 2 years, there was an accused man. Then there wasn't. And because the charge was dismissed without prejudice, the possibility of another prosecution technically remained. But another prosecution would require something new. Evidence. Not headlines. Not suspicion. Not old theories. Evidence. Something that could survive in court. Something that could close the gaps. Something that could answer the questions that had survived since 1988. Who was the man who left Checkers with Cynthia? What happened after they left? How did Cynthia end up in that cemetery? Who knew where she was? Who knew what happened? And who remained silent? Those questions are not accusations. They are the unanswered architecture of the case. And that distinction matters. Because Cynthia's story has attracted enormous attention, but the facts must remain separate from speculation. The public record establishes that she disappeared after leaving Checkers and that her body was found 10 days later. It establishes that Timmons was questioned in 1988. It establishes that he was indicted in 2019. And it establishes that prosecutors dismissed the murder charge in 2021 because witnesses had died and legal changes made the prosecution more difficult. What it does not establish is a courtroom finding that Timmons killed Cynthia. There was no murder conviction. That is where the factual record ends. And that is where the mystery begins again. Because once the legal case disappeared, the original question returned. Not who was indicted. Not who was suspected. Not who appeared in a documentary. Who actually killed Cynthia Smith? For investigators, that question may remain open. For her family, it never closed. For the community, it became part of local memory. And for anyone examining the case today, the most striking feature is not simply that a suspect was arrested decades later. It is that the passage of time nearly destroyed the possibility of proving what happened. A witness dies. A memory fades. A law changes. A piece of evidence disappeared. One by one, the pillars of the prosecution collapsed, and the murder remained standing. Cynthia's body was found. Her identity was known. Her death was investigated. But the person responsible was never convicted. The case remains one of those rare investigations where the biggest breakthrough did not produce the expected ending. The cold case was reopened. The suspect was indicted. The spotlight arrived. And then the courtroom door closed. Not forever, but long enough for the silence to return. Cynthia had waited more than 30 years for the case to move. The investigation moved. Then it stopped. And somewhere beneath the paperwork, beneath the old witness statements, beneath the photographs and reports from 1988, the original mystery remains untouched. A woman left a bar. A man was seen with her. She never came home. 10 days later, she was found dead. 31 years later, someone was accused. 2 years later, the accusation disappeared. But Cynthia's death did not. That is the difference between a case being dismissed and a mystery being solved. The legal charge can vanish. The unanswered question cannot. And as long as that question remains, the case is still waiting for the one thing that time has failed to destroy completely. The truth. By the time the murder charge disappeared, the story of Cynthia Smith had already passed through 3 different versions of the same nightmare. First, she was a missing mother. Then, she became the victim of an unsolved homicide. And finally, more than 3 decades later, she became the center of a prosecution that briefly appeared to offer the possibility of an answer. None of those chapters ended cleanly. The first ended when her body was found. The second ended with an indictment. The third ended with a dismissal. But Cynthia herself remained at the center of all 3. She was 31 years old when she disappeared in July 1988. She had 2 young sons on July 28th. She left them with a babysitter before going to Checkers restaurant and bar in Mount Vernon, Missouri. She failed to return. A missing person report followed. Her body was discovered 10 days later in the Dry Valley Cemetery area near Pierce City. That sequence is simple when written on paper. Living mother. Night out. Disappearance. Search. Body. But real life does not move in neat lines. For the people who knew Cynthia, there was no clean transition between those moments. There was only confusion. At first, the central question was not who killed her. It was much simpler. Where's Cynthia? Someone had expected her to come back. Someone had expected the babysitter to see her again. Someone had expected her to walk through the door. But the hours passed. Then the night. Then the next day. And the missing person investigation began. That was the first transformation. Cynthia's ordinary absence became alarming, then frightening, then impossible to explain. And when investigators eventually found her body, the question changed forever. She was no longer simply missing. She was dead. The investigation became a homicide investigation. The search for Cynthia became a search for the person responsible for her death. And one of the most important facts from the beginning was that she had reportedly been seen leaving the Mount Vernon establishment with an unidentified man. That detail became a shadow over the entire case. Someone had been with her. But the public record does not establish a definitive identity for that man. That means the last known movement of Cynthia remained partly unexplained. She had entered the bar. She had spent the night there. She had left. Then she vanished into the darkness between Mount Vernon and the area around Pierce City. The distance itself became part of the mystery. The place where she was found was rural, quiet, removed from the atmosphere of the bar. The contrast was stark. The night had begun with people, conversation, and lights. It ended in a cemetery. That was where the investigation eventually led, and somewhere between those 2 locations was the truth. But investigators did not have a time machine. They had witnesses. They had statements. They had whatever physical evidence remained. They had memories. And they had a problem that would become more serious with every passing year. Time. In 1988, investigators questioned Lawrence Timmons. They did not charge him with Cynthia's murder at that time. That fact would become enormously important decades later, because when the case was reopened, Timmons was not a completely new name. He had already been part of the original investigation. The difference was that 31 years had passed, and the investigation had new information. In 2019, the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office announced that it had reopened the cold case after being contacted by a private investigation firm with new information. Investigators worked for several months before turning that information over to the Lawrence County prosecutor, who presented it to a grand jury. On September 6, still 2019, the grand jury indicted Timmons for murder. The announcement changed everything. A case that had been dormant for decades suddenly became active. A man who had once been questioned without being charged was now formally accused. The word cold case suddenly became national news, and Cynthia's family was forced to confront a reality they had waited decades to see. There was finally a defendant. But a defendant is not the same thing as an answer. The indictment alleged that Timmons deliberately caused Cynthia's death by striking her. The allegation was serious. The case was serious. But the burden of proving it remained with the prosecution, and that burden became increasingly difficult as the investigation moved through the court. The prosecution had to reconstruct events from 1988. Witnesses had to remember. Old statements had to be examined. Evidence had to be tested against modern legal standards. And every weakness mattered, because the defense did not need to solve Cynthia's murder. The defense only needed to show that the prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. That is how the courtroom works. It does not ask whether a theory sounds convincing. It asks whether the evidence is sufficient. And 33 years had created enormous gaps. Some of the people connected to the case were no longer alive. That became critical. By December 2021, prosecutor Don Trotter said 2 witnesses had died and that the loss of their testimony left the prosecution without enough evidence to proceed. Think about what that means. A witness is not merely a name in a report. A witness can provide context. A witness can explain a conversation. A witness can identify a person. A witness can clarify what happened when investigators did not have cameras, digital records, or modern tracking technology. When that witness dies, the information may not completely disappear, but its legal value can change dramatically. And that is exactly what happened. Another major problem involved Timmons' former wife in Oklahoma. Prosecutors had hoped to use her testimony, but she had been murdered. A change in Missouri law meant that prosecutors could not use testimony from a murdered witness under the circumstances they faced unless they could establish that the defendant had killed that person specifically to prevent testimony. According to Trotter, that was not what prosecutors believed they could establish in this situation. One piece vanished. Then another. Then another. The case was being weakened not necessarily because investigators had disproved the evidence, but because the passage of time had made the evidence harder to use. That distinction is crucial. Cold cases do not always die because investigators were wrong. Sometimes they die because the people who could explain the truth are gone. Sometimes they die because evidence cannot be legally admitted. Sometimes they die because the surviving evidence contains too many gaps. And sometimes they survive only because someone refuses to stop looking. Cynthia's case had reached that dangerous point. The investigation had produced an indictment, but the prosecution had not yet produced a conviction. And those are 2 very different milestones. The public had seen the arrest. The public had seen the headline. The case had even become the subject of the true crime program Cold Justice. The investigation was later featured in an episode titled Small Town Predator. That television exposure brought Cynthia's story back into public attention. Her sons, Sean and Jason, were grown men by then. They had been children when she died. Sean was 8. Jason was 4. They had grown up without their mother. The television investigation reunited them with memories from childhood and allowed investigators to revisit the case with witnesses who were still alive. That human element was impossible to ignore. For investigators, Cynthia was a case. For her sons, she was their mother. A photograph. A voice they remembered. A woman who had once taken them camping. A person who should have been there as they grew older. The passage of time had changed them. But it had not changed what they had lost. And that was why the 2019 indictment carried so much emotional weight. For the first time, there was a possibility that the family might hear the truth in court. Instead, the case eventually stopped. December 2021. The murder charge was dismissed. Without prejudice. The prosecutor said new evidence could allow the charge to be filed again. That phrase created a strange ending. There was no verdict. No acquittal. No conviction. No definitive judicial determination about who killed Cynthia. The case simply lost the legal momentum it had gained. And then Lawrence Timmons was released from custody related to the murder charge. According to local reporting, he was released on December 21st, SIL 2021, on bond with ankle monitoring and was ordered to have no contact with witnesses in the case. Imagine the emotional collision of those facts. For decades, Cynthia's family had lived with an unanswered murder. Then a suspect was indicted. Then the charge disappeared. Then the accused man was outside jail again. The legal system had moved. But the family was still standing at the same unanswered question: who killed Cynthia? And that question became even more difficult because the original investigation had produced other possible lines of inquiry. Contemporary reporting said investigators in 1988 had considered two chief suspects: Cynthia's estranged husband, Lewis Smith, and Lawrence Timmons. Cynthia and Lewis were reportedly in the process of divorcing at the time. That fact matters because it reminds us that the 2019 indictment did not erase the uncertainty that existed in 1988. The original investigation had multiple directions. Timmons became the focus of the later prosecution. But a prosecution ending does not automatically resolve every alternative possibility. That is another reason Cynthia's case remains difficult to summarize with a single sentence. There was no courtroom verdict. There was no confession that conclusively explained everything. There was no publicly established chain of events that filled every missing hour. There was only a series of facts connected by unanswered questions. And perhaps the most haunting fact is how little Cynthia's final journey can be reconstructed with certainty. She was seen at Checkers. She left. She disappeared. 10 days later, her body was found. That is the line. Everything between those points is where the darkness begins. A witness remembered seeing Timmons asking women to dance that night. Marilyn Chambers, who had driven Cynthia to Checkers, later recalled being uncomfortable around him and wanting to leave. She remembered Cynthia saying Timmons was going to take her home. That memory became important when the case was reopened. But even that recollection does not answer every question. It tells investigators something about the night. It does not provide a complete account of what happened afterward. And that is where cold case investigations become brutally difficult. One piece of evidence may tell you who was present. Another may tell you where someone was. Another may tell you what someone said. But none of them necessarily tells you what happened in the critical minutes when a person died. Those minutes are gone. The witnesses may not have seen them. The evidence may not have survived them. And Cynthia could never describe them. That is why the case remains so unsettling. The beginning is partially visible. The ending is known. The middle is missing. And the middle contains the murder. For more than 3 decades, investigators have tried to bridge that gap. They came close in 2019. Then the bridge collapsed. But the investigation itself proved that the gap could be examined again. That matters, because the case was not forgotten. The Lawrence County Sheriff's Office had officially reopened it. Private investigators had worked with authorities. A grand jury had considered the evidence. An indictment had been issued. And even after the dismissal, the prosecutor left open the possibility of future charges if new evidence emerged. So the file remains a warning and an invitation. A warning that time destroys evidence. An invitation to find whatever survived. Because somewhere in the old records may still be the detail that changes everything. A detail that was overlooked. A witness who never came forward. A statement that was never properly connected. A piece of physical evidence that could be examined with technology unavailable in 1988. Or a person who knows something and has carried that knowledge for more than 30 years. The danger is that silence can become permanent. People take secrets to their graves. Witnesses die. Memories disappear. And eventually, investigators can be left with nothing but paper. The paper can survive. Records can survive. Names can survive. And Cynthia's name has survived. That may be the most important thing of all, because the case is not simply about the person accused. It is about the woman who never got to grow old, the boys who grew up without their mother, the family that had to wait decades for movement, and the community that watched a disappearance become one of its most enduring mysteries. The cemetery remains. The roads remain. The old records remain. The unanswered question remains. And somewhere inside that silence is the truth. The indictment did not reveal it. The dismissal did not erase it. And time has not destroyed the need to find it. Cynthia Smith disappeared on a summer night in 1988. More than 3 decades later, her case still carries the same terrible contradiction. Investigators know how the story ended. They still do not know, in a legally established sense, exactly who was responsible. The final answer is still missing. And until someone finds it, Cynthia's story remains suspended between two words that define every cold case. What happened? The case had reached the point where the facts were no longer enough to tell the whole story. There were facts about Cynthia Smith. There were facts about the night she disappeared. There were facts about Lawrence Timmons. There were facts about the investigation that began in 1988, the reopening in 2019, the indictment, and the dismissal in 2021. But between those facts was something far harder to capture: silence. For more than 30 years, silence had surrounded the most important question in the case. What happened after Cynthia left Checkers? The surviving record can establish that Cynthia was last seen leaving the Mount Vernon bar on July 28, still 1988, with an unidentified man. She was reported missing after failing to return for her children, and her body was found 10 days later in a rural cemetery near Pierce City. Those facts create a timeline, but they do not explain the missing hour, and those missing hours are where the entire mystery lived. The original investigation had begun immediately. This was not a case where authorities waited 30 years before anyone cared. The disappearance was investigated when it happened. People were questioned. Leads were followed. Timmons himself was questioned. But investigators did not charge him with Cynthia's murder in 1988. Then the years began to pass. 1 year, 5, 10, 20, 30. The case became old. The people who remembered the night became older. Some moved away. Some forgot details. Some died. And eventually, the investigation became a cold case. Then came 2019. Something changed. A private investigation firm contacted the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office with new information. The Sheriff's Office reopened the case. Investigators worked for months, eventually turning the information over to prosecutor Don Trotter. The evidence went before a grand jury. On September 6th, still 2019, the grand jury indicted Lawrence Timmons for Cynthia's murder. For the first time in decades, the investigation had momentum. The old file was moving. The suspect had a name. The courtroom doors were opening. But the prosecution was not simply trying to prove that Timmons had once been investigated. It had to establish that he was responsible for Cynthia's death. That meant returning to the evidence. And the evidence led backward. Back to the bar. Back to the witnesses. Back to the people who had known Cynthia. Back to the people who remembered Timmons. And back to memories that were more than 3 decades old. One witness, Marilyn Chambers, had driven Cynthia to Checkers that night. Later, Chambers recalled seeing Timmons at the establishment and remembered Cynthia saying that Timmons was going to take her home. That recollection became significant during the renewed investigation. But even a powerful memory has limits. Chambers could remember seeing Cynthia. She could remember seeing Timmons. She could remember what she believed Cynthia said. But she could not testify to everything that happened after Cynthia left. Nobody could. That was the problem. The final part of Cynthia's journey remained hidden. The investigators knew the destination. They did not have a complete record of the road, and that distinction would eventually become the difference between an indictment and a conviction. The grand jury had indicted Timmons for first-degree murder. The indictment alleged that he deliberately caused Cynthia's death by striking her. But an indictment does not require the same level of proof as a conviction. It is a formal accusation. A trial would require something more, much more. The defense would challenge the evidence. The prosecution would have to present its witnesses. The jury would have to evaluate the testimony. And every weakness created by 33 years would become visible. There was no way to hide the passage of time. 2 witnesses who could have helped the prosecution died before the case could reach a successful conclusion. Trotter later said the prosecution had already been dealing with missing evidence when the investigation began, and that losing additional witnesses left them without enough evidence to proceed. The phrase, missing evidence, is almost impossible to overstate. A cold case is already an investigation built around absence. The victim is gone. The crime scene has changed. The witnesses are older. The memories are incomplete. Then evidence disappears too. At that point, investigators are no longer simply trying to discover what happened. They are trying to reconstruct a vanished world. The world of 1988. The roads. The buildings. The people. The conversations. The routines. The relationships. Everything has changed. Even the bar where Cynthia was last seen was no longer part of the same world. But the evidence needed to explain her death belonged to that world. That is why the investigation became so dependent on people. People who remembered. People who could identify. People who could explain. People who could testify. And when those people died, the case became weaker. Then came the most complicated legal problem. Timmons's former wife in Oklahoma was another potential source of testimony. But she had been murdered. Under a change in Missouri law, prosecutors faced restrictions on using testimony from a person who had been murdered. Trotter explained that the state would have needed to establish that the defendant killed that witness specifically to prevent her from testifying, he said. Prosecutors could not establish that in this case. That meant another piece of the prosecution's case was effectively removed. The investigators might still believe information connected to that witness mattered, but belief is not enough. The courtroom requires admissible evidence, and that is where the cold case began to fracture. The investigation had found a path. The law blocked part of it. The witnesses who remained could not replace everyone who was gone, and the prosecution reached a point where it could no longer say that it had enough evidence to obtain a conviction. In December 2021, Trotter dismissed the murder charge without prejudice. That was the second great shock in the case. The first had come in 2019. The old case was alive again. The second came 2 years later. The murder prosecution was gone. But the meaning of that dismissal has to be understood carefully. It did not establish that Cynthia's murder had not happened. It did not establish that another person had been responsible. And it did not produce a jury verdict finding Timmons innocent. There had been no murder trial resulting in a verdict. Timmons's attorney, Adam Woody, said his client had always maintained his innocence. The charge was dismissed because prosecutors believed the surviving evidence was insufficient to move forward. And because it was dismissed without prejudice, the possibility of refiling remained if new evidence emerged. That left the case in an unusual legal position. Not solved. Not permanently closed. Not resolved through a verdict. Waiting. And waiting is exactly what Cynthia's family had already been doing for decades. The emotional damage of a cold case is difficult to measure. A conventional tragedy has an ending. A funeral. A verdict. A sentence. A moment when everyone knows what happened. A cold case offers none of those things. There is no final scene. Instead, there is a question. Every year, every birthday, every family gathering, every photograph, the question remains, who killed her? For Cynthia's sons, the question was particularly painful because they had been children when she disappeared. They grew up. She did not. They reached adulthood. She remained 31. They experienced milestones she should have witnessed. She was absent. The investigation could eventually identify suspect. It could produce an indictment. But it could never restore the years that Cynthia lost. That is the part of the case no courtroom could repair. And yet the family continued to seek answers. The renewed investigation gave them something they had not had for decades. Hope. Not certainty. Hope. There is a difference. Hope is fragile. It can survive 30 years. It can survive an indictment. But it can also be destroyed by a dismissal. When the murder charge disappeared, the family was left once again with uncertainty. The case had moved. Then it stopped. And the person accused of killing Cynthia was no longer facing that murder charge. Timmons was released from the Lawrence County Jail on December 21st, SIL 2021, after the murder charge was dropped. He was released on bond with ankle monitoring and ordered to have no contact with witnesses. The image was almost impossible to reconcile. For decades, Cynthia's family had waited for movement. Now the accused man was outside jail, and the murder remained unresolved. But the legal system had not said the investigation was finished forever. The prosecutor had explicitly left open the possibility of future charges if new evidence emerged. That means the case still has a narrow path forward. A narrow path, but a path. The problem is finding what could walk down it. New evidence in a case this old is rare, but not impossible. A forgotten witness could come forward. An old statement could be reevaluated. A surviving physical item could become significant because of improved forensic technology. A person who remained silent for decades could decide to speak, or investigators could discover that a seemingly ordinary detail in the original file was actually important. That is how cold cases sometimes change. Not with a dramatic discovery. sometimes with one small detail, one name, one date, one contradiction, one photograph, one sentence, one person finally saying, "I know something." But until that happens, investigators must work with what remains. And what remains in Cynthia's case is a fractured timeline. She was alive when she went to Checkers. She was seen leaving. She was reportedly with an unidentified man. Then she disappeared. 10 days later, her body was discovered. The original investigation questioned Timmons. No murder charge followed. More than 30 years later, the case was reopened. A grand jury indicted him. 2 years later, the prosecution dismissed the charge. That is the documented arc. Everything beyond it has to be treated carefully, because the temptation in a cold case is to fill the silence. People want motives. They want a killer. They want a final scene. They want justice. But when the evidence does not provide those things, the responsible story has to leave the empty spaces empty. That is not weakness. That is honesty. And Cynthia's story deserves honesty. The public record does not establish a conviction against Timmons for her murder. It establishes an accusation and a later dismissal. That distinction matters because a cold case can create powerful public assumptions. An arrest can look like proof. An indictment can look like proof. A television investigation can look like proof. None of those things is a conviction. The only legal conclusion available from the murder prosecution is that it was dismissed without prejudice because prosecutors believed they lacked enough evidence to proceed. And so the mystery survives. Not because nobody cared. Not because investigators never worked. Not because Cynthia was forgotten. The mystery survives because the evidence needed to close it did not survive intact. That is the cruel mathematics of time. In 1988, a witness might have known something. In 2019, that witness might have been the key. In 2021, that witness might have been dead. And when the witness disappears, the truth does not necessarily disappear with them, but the ability to prove the truth can. That is what happened to this case. Or at least, that is what the surviving record tells us. And still, one question remains stronger than all the legal language. What happened to Cynthia after she left Checkers? No indictment can answer that by itself. No dismissal can answer it. No documentary can answer it. Only evidence can. The kind of evidence that survives scrutiny. The kind of evidence that can finally reconstruct the missing hour. Because Cynthia's story has never been about one night alone. It is about everything that followed. The decades of uncertainty. The old case file. The witnesses. The reopening. The arrest. The courtroom. The dismissal. The family waiting again. And the possibility that somewhere, buried inside an old investigation, is the detail that investigators miss. Maybe it is sitting in a file. Maybe it exists in someone's memory. Maybe someone knows more than they have ever admitted. Maybe the answer has been closer than anyone realized. Or maybe the final piece is gone forever. That is what makes the case so haunting. The truth may still exist, but nobody knows where. Cynthia was found. Her killer was not legally established, and the investigation remains suspended between the past and the present. The cemetery where she was discovered is no longer simply a location. It is the final known point in a journey that began with an ordinary night out. A mother left her children. She went to a bar. She was seen leaving. She never came home. 10 days later, investigators found her body. More than 30 years later, the state accused a man. 2 years after that, the charge disappeared. And after all the headlines, all the investigation, all the legal arguments, and all the years, the most important person in the case remains the person who can no longer speak. Cynthia Smith. Her silence is permanent. The investigation's silence does not have to be, because the charge was dismissed without prejudice. The possibility of new evidence remains, and somewhere beyond the old reports, beyond the memories that have faded, beyond the witnesses who are gone, there may still be one surviving piece capable of breaking the silence. Until that piece is found, the case remains what it has always been. A mother who never came home. A cemetery that became her final known location. A suspect who was accused but never convicted. And a question that has survived longer than anyone expected. Who really killed Cynthia Smith? For 33 years, Cynthia Smith's case moved almost entirely in one direction, backward. Investigators returned to 1988. They returned to the people who had known Cynthia. They returned to the night she disappeared. They returned to the old statements. They returned to the places connected to her final hour. Then, in 2019, something changed. The investigation stopped looking only backward. It began looking again. A private investigation firm contacted the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office with new information. Detectives reopened the cold case and spent months working through the material before turning it over to prosecutor Don Trotter. The prosecutor presented the information to a grand jury, and on September 6, 2019, Lawrence Timmons was indicted for Cynthia's murder. 31 years had passed. But suddenly, the old case had a heartbeat. The indictment accused Timmons of deliberately causing Cynthia's death by striking her. For investigators, this was no longer simply an old file. It was a criminal prosecution. For Cynthia's family, it was something even more personal. A possibility. A possibility that the unanswered question might finally have an answer. But the law does not run on possibilities. It runs on evidence. And evidence was exactly what the years had been taking away. The original case had been built in 1988, long before modern digital investigations became routine. There was no smartphone capable of recording a person's location. No digital trail automatically documenting every movement. No social media timeline. No network of cameras covering every major road. Investigators had people. They had statements. They had physical evidence. They had memory. And memory was already beginning to fade. Cynthia had been seen at Checkers Bar and Grill in Mount Vernon on July 28, 1988. She was later reported missing. 10 days after her disappearance, her body was discovered in a dirt lane leading to Dry Valley Cemetery, roughly 5 miles northwest of Pierce City. Those facts never changed. But the people who could explain what happened between them did. Some witnesses were no longer alive. Some could no longer remember the details with certainty. And some evidence that investigators might once have relied upon was simply gone. Prosecutor Trotter eventually described the case as a 33-year-old investigation with missing evidence from the beginning. He said prosecutors needed everything they had. Instead, they kept losing pieces. That sentence captures the tragedy of the prosecution. The case did not suddenly become weak in 2021. It had been weakening for decades. The clock had been working against it every day. Every year without a trial created another opportunity for something important to disappear. A witness could die. A memory could become unreliable. A document could be lost. A piece of physical evidence could deteriorate. A legal rule could change. And then, when the state finally had a suspect, it discovered that time had already taken too much. There was another complication. Timmons had been questioned in the original 1988 investigation. He had not been charged with Cynthia's murder then. That meant investigators in 2019 were not starting with a completely unknown person. They were revisiting an old name, an old lead, an old investigation. But something had changed. New information had appeared. That information was significant enough to bring the case before a grand jury. The grand jury returned an indictment. The public saw the headline. The cold case had cracked. But a cracked case is not necessarily a solved case. That distinction became more important with every hearing. Timmons maintained his innocence through his attorney. The prosecution continued examining the evidence, and the legal battle moved into the courtroom. Because of the publicity surrounding the case, proceedings were transferred from Lawrence County to Jasper County. The location changed. The case did not. The courtroom changed. Cynthia's story did not. The years remained. The missing witnesses remained. The unanswered questions remained. And the prosecution still faced the same impossible task. Prove what happened in 1988 with evidence available in the 2020 at. That is when a cold case becomes a race against time in reverse. The investigators are moving forward. The evidence is moving backward. Every new step is fighting against everything that has disappeared. And in Cynthia's case, the losses became devastating. 2 witnesses died while the prosecution was trying to move the murder case forward. Without their testimony, Trotter said the case could not proceed. There was no way to replace them. A police report could record what a witness once said, but a report is not always the same as having the witness appear in court. A prosecutor could not put a dead witness on the stand. The defense could not cross-examine that witness. The jury could not watch the witness speak. The testimony could not be tested in the ordinary way, and the absence of those voices left holes in the prosecution's case. Then came another blow. Timmons's former wife in Oklahoma had been murdered. Prosecutors had hoped her testimony could be used, but Missouri law had changed. Under the new statute, testimony from a murdered person could be used against a defendant only under particular circumstances involving the reason for that person's killing. Trotter said the circumstances did not meet that requirement. The testimony, therefore, could not provide the prosecution with the support it had hoped for. The effect was devastating. One witness gone. 2 more witnesses gone. Evidence already missing. A 33-year-old timeline. And a legal system demanding proof strong enough to survive trial. The prosecution had reached the point where suspicion was not enough. The indictment had created a formal accusation, but the next step required something far more difficult, a conviction. And a conviction required evidence, not rumors, not theories, not a television episode, not an old suspicion. Evidence. That is why the eventual dismissal should not be confused with a finding that the murder did not happen. Cynthia was dead. That was never in question. The question was whether the state could prove its case against Timmons. In December 2021, the answer was no. The murder charge was dismissed without prejudice. That phrase became one of the most important phrases in the entire investigation. Without prejudice. It meant the prosecution was not permanently barred from pursuing the charge if new evidence emerged. The case was not legally transformed into an acquittal. There was no jury verdict saying Timmons was innocent. There was no trial verdict identifying another killer. The prosecution simply did not believe it had enough evidence to continue, and that distinction left the case suspended. Not solved. Not erased. Suspended. Timmons was released from the Lawrence County Jail on December 21st, SIL 2021, on a $12,500 bond with ankle monitoring. He was ordered to have no contact with witnesses in the case. The man who had been accused of Cynthia's murder was no longer being prosecuted for that murder. And Cynthia remained dead. Her family remained without a conviction. The cemetery remained. The old case file remained. The questions remained. There was no dramatic final scene. No confession. No courtroom declaration. No moment when everyone finally knew. Instead, the case returned to the same uncomfortable place it had occupied for most of its history, waiting. But something had changed. The world now knew more about the case than it had known before 2019. The public knew that the investigation had been reopened. The public knew that new information had been presented to a grand jury. The public knew that Timmons had been indicted. The public knew that prosecutors later dismissed the murder charge because of evidentiary problem. And the public knew that a future prosecution could theoretically happen if new evidence emerged. That left one possibility. The evidence might still be out there, not necessarily in a dramatic form. It might be something ordinary, a forgotten document, an old photograph, a statement buried in another case file, a person who never understood the importance of what they saw, a memory that suddenly returns, or evidence that investigators in 1988 could not properly analyze. Cold cases sometimes survive because of exactly those kinds of details. Not because the truth is obvious, because the truth is incomplete. Cynthia's case is especially difficult because the known timeline contains such a sharp break. There is the beginning. She goes out. She is seen. She leaves. Then there is the ending. Her body is found. Between those points is the darkness, the missing time. That is where investigators have always needed to work. And that is where the strongest evidence would have to lead. Who was with Cynthia? Where did they go? Why did she not return home? How did she end up near Dry Valley Cemetery? Who knew she was there? And who knew enough to keep silent? The public record cannot answer all of those questions. And that is precisely why the case should not be turned into fiction disguised as fact. The temptation is powerful. A headline demands an ending. A documentary demands a climax. A YouTube audience wants a revelation. But Cynthia's real story does not provide one. Not yet. What it provides is something more disturbing. A real disappearance. A real murder. A real investigation. A real indictment. And a real prosecution that ultimately failed because the surviving evidence was insufficient. That is already shocking enough. The case demonstrates how fragile justice can become when decades pass. In 1988, the investigators had access to people who could describe the night. In 2019, many of those people were older or gone. In 2021, prosecutors said, The case had lost too much evidence to proceed. The timeline itself became an enemy. And the longer the case remained unresolved, the harder resolution became. That is the cruel paradox. The family wants time to solve the case. Time is exactly what makes the case harder to solve. Every year feels like another year closer to justice. But every year can also mean another witness lost, another memory weakened, another piece of evidence gone. The clock never stops. And Cynthia's case has been racing against it since 1988. Still, the 2019 investigation mattered. It proves that cold cases can move. It proves that an investigation can be reopened decades later. It proves that information can emerge after years of silence. The Lawrence County Sheriff's Office did not simply reopen the file and wait. Investigators worked for months before turning the information over to the prosecutor and grand jury. That work resulted in an indictment. It was a genuine breakthrough. It simply was not the final breakthrough. And that may be the most important lesson in Cynthia's story. A breakthrough is not always an ending. Sometimes it is only proof that the door can still open. The door opened in 2019. It closed again in 2021. But it did not disappear. And as long as it remains possible to reopen the case, the story is not necessarily finished. Cynthia's family has already waited more than 3 decades. The case has already survived investigators, prosecutors, changing laws, changing technology, and changing generations. The question is whether the evidence can survive. Somewhere in the remaining record, there may be a detail that has not yet been given its full weight. Somewhere there may be a person who remembers something differently now. Somewhere there may be a connection that investigators have not made. Or perhaps the most painful possibility is the simplest. Perhaps the evidence necessary to prove the truth is gone. That is the fear behind every aging cold case. Not that the truth does not exist, that the truth may exist only in the mind of someone who can no longer speak. Cynthia cannot speak. Some of the witnesses cannot speak. And the people who remain are left trying to reconstruct a night that happened before the modern world made recording life almost automatic. 33 years passed before an indictment. 2 years later, that indictment disappeared. But the murder did not disappear with it. The case still carries Cynthia's name. It still carries the date. It still carries the cemetery. It still carries the unanswered questions. And it still carries the possibility that somewhere beyond the surviving evidence, someone knows what happened. Maybe they knew in 1988. Maybe they knew in 1998. Maybe they knew in 2008. Maybe they still know today. The hardest question is not whether the case can be reopened. It is whether anyone will ever be willing to open the door. Because cold cases do not always end when investigators stop looking. Sometimes they end when everyone who knows the answer decides to remain silent. And silence can last longer than a lifetime. For Cynthia's family, however, silence has never been the same as closure. There is no closure in an unanswered murder. There is only absence, a photograph, a name, a memory, and a question repeated across generations. Who killed Cynthia Smith? The 2019 indictment did not answer it. The 2021 dismissal did not answer it. And the passing years have not answered it. But the case remains, waiting for the one piece of evidence that cannot be argued away. The one witness who cannot be silenced by time. The one fact that finally connects the beginning to the end. Until then, Cynthia's final journey remains incomplete. She walked into the night alive. She disappeared. 10 days later, she was found dead. 33 years later, an accusation briefly brought the case back into the light. Then the courtroom went quiet again. And somewhere inside that silence, the real answer is still waiting.